Before he even walked into the room, they told him the rules. Don't look him in the eye, don't speak unless spoken to, and whatever you do, don't let him smell your fear. But as Leo's bare hands pressed against the ruined, untouchable flesh of the city's most ruthless alpha, he broke every single rule, and the alpha let him. Before we dive into this intense story, if you love high-stakes alpha/omega romances, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment down below to let me know you're watching. Your support means the world and helps the channel grow. Now let's begin. Part 1. The Untouchable Syndicate. The private elevator ascending to the 75th floor of the Vance Tower was silent, save for the faint hum of the mechanics. Inside stood Leo Brooks, a 27-year-old Omega physical therapist, staring straight ahead at the polished metal doors. He held a sleek black medical bag in his right hand. His pulse was steady. His breathing was measured. To his left and right stood two men who were built like freight trains, both dominant alphas, both armed with concealed weapons that weren't actually very concealed. They were sweating. Leo wasn't. "You understand the protocol, Brooks," the guard on the left, a man named Marcus, said. His voice was low, strained with an anxiety that seemed wildly out of place for a mafia enforcer. "When the doors open, you keep your head down. You do not speak to him directly unless he asks you a question. You do not make sudden movements. And if he tells you to stop, you drop your hands immediately. Do you understand?" Leo didn't turn his head. "I'm a physical therapist, Marcus. Not a hostage. I know how to treat a patient." "He's not a normal patient," the other guard muttered, his jaw tight. "He hasn't let a doctor touch him in 8 years. The last one who tried to force a procedure without his explicit permission left with a broken jaw and 2 shattered kneecaps. He's volatile." Leo finally glanced at them. "Then it's a good thing I'm not here to force anything. I'm here to fix what everyone else is too terrified to look at." The elevator chimed. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing the penthouse medical suite. It was a sprawling, sterile space encased in floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass, overlooking the glittering skyline of the city. But the view wasn't what commanded the room. It was the air. The moment the doors opened, it hit Leo like a physical wall. Alpha pheromones. But not just any alpha. This was pure, unadulterated dominance. It smelled like dark cedar, crushed ozone, and danger. It was the kind of scent that was designed by nature to make Omegas drop to their knees and bare their throats in absolute submission. The 2 guards beside Leo immediately stiffened, their own alpha instincts warring between the urge to fight and the overwhelming compulsion to submit. Leo felt the heavy pressure pressing down on his chest, a primal weight trying to force the air from his lungs. His inner Omega flared, a sudden spike of anxiety warning him to run. He ignored it. He took a slow, deep breath, locked his knees, and walked forward. There were 6 more guards inside the room. They were stationed at the corners, hands resting loosely near their holsters, their eyes wide and watchful. In the center of the room, sitting on the edge of a state-of-the-art therapy table, was Julian Vance, 32 years old, the undisputed head of the Vance Syndicate, a man who controlled the city's underground with a grip of iron and a heart of ice. Julian was tall, broad-shouldered, and lethal. Even sitting down, he radiated an aura of immense power. He wore dark slacks and a black silk shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, casting shadows over his sharp, aristocratic features. But it was his eyes that froze people in place. They were a piercing, icy gray, completely devoid of warmth. 8 years ago, a rival family had tried to take Julian out with a car bomb. They failed, but the shrapnel had torn through Julian's right shoulder, chest, and back. He had survived, but the massive tissue damage and misaligned healing had left him with severe nerve lock and chronic pain. The muscles had tightened over the years, forming a rigid prison around his upper body. He was suffering every single day, but his paranoia and pride refused to let anyone close enough to heal him. Until his second-in-command had secretly hired Leo, the only Omega therapist in the country with a reputation for handling impossible cases. Julian didn't look up as Leo approached. He simply stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. The silence in the room was deafening. It felt like standing inside a powder keg, waiting for a single spark. Leo stopped exactly 3 feet from the table. He set his black medical bag on a nearby metal tray. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot. 3 guards flinched. Julian slowly, very slowly, raised his head. His gray eyes locked onto Leo. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. They sent an Omega. Julian's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the chest. It wasn't a question. It was a statement laced with a dangerous mix of amusement and disgust. My men are either getting stupid, or they have a very dark sense of humor. Leo didn't lower his gaze. He didn't bow his head. He looked straight into the eyes of the most dangerous man in the country. Your men hired the best specialist available, Mr. Vance. My secondary gender has nothing to do with my medical license. A collective breath hitched in the room. One of the guards, a massive man by the door, actually took a half step forward, waiting for Julian to snap. You didn't talk back to Julian Vance. You just didn't. Julian's eyes narrowed fractionally. The pheromones in the room thickened, rolling out in a heavy, deliberate wave aimed directly at Leo. It was a test. A crushing, invisible force designed to break the Omega's will. Leo felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His legs trembled slightly under the sheer, suffocating weight of the Alpha's dominance. Every biological wire in his body screamed at him to submit. Leo gripped the edge of the metal tray, knuckles turning white, and held his ground. He forced his breathing to remain steady. He did not look away. 10 seconds passed. 15. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Then Julian blinked. The crushing pressure receded slightly, pulling back like the tide. A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the Alpha's cold eyes. Curiosity. You're shaking, Omega, Julian stated quietly. I'm breathing, Leo corrected, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. And you're wasting time. If you want to keep living with a frozen shoulder and chronic nerve pain, I can leave. But if you want to be able to lift your right arm above your head without masking a grimace, you'll take your shirt off and lie face down on this table. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. Marcus, the guard who had brought Leo up, closed his eyes, silently praying for the Omega's soul. Julian stared at Leo. For a moment, his hand twitched. The guards braced themselves. But Julian didn't reach for a weapon. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, his left hand moved to the buttons of his black shirt. With stiff, restricted movements, he unbuttoned it and shrugged it off his shoulders. The movement clearly caused him pain, a sharp flinch hidden behind a mask of stone, but he managed it. He tossed the shirt to the floor. Leo stepped forward. He finally saw the damage. From the right shoulder blade, trailing down his spine and wrapping around his ribs, was a massive network of thick, jagged scar tissue. It was brutal. The muscle underneath was knotted and warped, compensating for the injury in all the wrong ways. It was a mess of locked tension. Julian lay face down on the padded table. He didn't say a word, but the tension radiating from his body was explosive. I am going to apply a hot compress first to loosen the superficial tissue, Leo said, his voice entirely professional, shifting instantly into his element. Then, I am going to make direct contact. It will hurt. You will want to pull away. Do not. Just get it over with, Julian muttered into the headrest. Leo prepared the hot towel, infusing it with a mild, unscented muscle relaxant oil. He placed it gently over the darkest mass of scars on Julian's right shoulder. The moment the heat made contact, Julian's entire massive frame went rigid. His breath hitched sharply. The guards in the room instantly reached for their weapons, a chorus of safety clicks echoing in the quiet suite. Julian raised his left hand off the table, 2 fingers extended. A silent command. The guards froze. The weapons were lowered, though nobody relaxed. Breathe, Leo instructed calmly. He waited exactly 2 minutes, letting the heat penetrate the rigid flesh. Then he removed the towel. He poured a small amount of friction oil onto his own palms, rubbing them together to generate heat. I am initiating contact now, Leo warned softly. Leo placed both of his bare hands flat against Julian Vance's scarred back. The reaction was violent. Julian let out a sharp, guttural hiss. His muscles didn't just tense, they locked like steel cables snapping taut. The alpha pheromones exploded in the room, violent, aggressive, and wild. It was pure instinct, the body of a predator reacting to a perceived threat, remembering the trauma, remembering the pain. Don't fight it, Leo said, his voice firm, cutting through the heavy scent of danger. He didn't pull his hands away. If he hesitated now, he would lose the alpha's trust forever. He pressed deeper, finding the exact epicenter of the nerve lock. Your body thinks it's being attacked. You have to tell it you're safe. Breathe through it, Julian. He didn't use the man's title. He used his name. Julian's fingers dug into the leather of the therapy table, tearing the material. He was shaking. A man who hadn't let a single soul touch him in 8 long years was currently trembling under the firm, unrelenting hands of an Omega. Leo began to move his thumbs, applying a deep, circular friction technique directly over the hardened scar tissue. It was brutal, agonizing work. He had to break down years of fibrous buildup. "Stop," Julian ground out, his voice a low growl of pure menace. "No," Leo replied instantly, pressing harder. A guard stepped forward. "Hey," he said. "Shut up and stay exactly where you are." Leo snapped, not even looking up, his focus entirely on the massive alpha under his hands. "Julian, exhale. Push the air out. Now." For a second, it seemed like Julian was going to throw Leo across the room. The muscle under Leo's hands was vibrating with coiled violence. But then, a sound escaped Julian's lips. A long, shuddering exhale. And the impossible happened. The steel cable muscle beneath Leo's right palm suddenly gave way. It was a subtle shift, a tiny release of tension, but it was real. The locked joint softened just a fraction of an inch. The explosive pheromones in the room began to dial back. The suffocating pressure lifted. Julian's head rested heavily against the table, his breathing harsh and ragged, but the violent resistance was gone. He was letting Indiana. Leo continued to work, his movements precise, professional, and entirely fearless. He worked the scar tissue for another 20 minutes. Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody moved. The guards just watched in utter disbelief as the untouchable mafia boss allowed a young Omega to dig into his deepest wounds. "All right," Leo finally said, stepping back and wiping his hands on a clean towel. "We're done for today. Sit up." Slowly, Julian pushed himself up with his left arm. He sat on the edge of the table, his chest heaving slightly as if he had just run a marathon. He looked exhausted, but as he shifted his weight, he paused. Slowly, testing the movement, Julian rolled his right shoulder. There was a faint pop. The movement wasn't perfect, it was still stiff and heavily damaged, but the agonizing, sharp lock that had plagued him for 8 years didn't hit. The joint rotated slightly further than it had in a decade. Julian froze. He looked at his own shoulder, then slowly lifted his gaze to look at Leo. The cold, dead eyes from earlier were gone. Now they were dark, intense, burning with something that Leo couldn't quite read, and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. The air in the room shifted again, but this time, it wasn't aggressive dominance. It was something heavier, something possessive. "You didn't flinch," Julian said, his voice quiet, carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I told you," Leo said, packing his bag and zipping it shut. "I treat the injury. I don't care about your reputation." Leo picked up his bag and turned to leave. He had done his job. He had survived day 1. Omega. The single word stopped Leo in his tracks. He turned back. Julian was staring at him, his bare chest rising and falling slowly. The dominant alpha pheromones began to swirl around Leo again, but this time they were wrapping around him, testing the waters, locking onto his scent. "Tomorrow," Julian commanded softly, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. "You don't send a replacement. You don't send a proxy. You come back yourself. And you don't stop until I say you're done." It wasn't a request for medical treatment. It was an order. And it was deeply, dangerously personal. Leo held the alpha's gaze for a long moment. He knew he should walk away. He knew stepping back into this penthouse meant stepping into a world he might never escape. He nodded once. "Tomorrow." End of Part 1. Part 2. The second evening, the air inside the Vance Tower didn't feel explosive. It felt expectant, which was infinitely more terrifying. Leo Brooks stepped out of the private elevator onto the 75th floor at exactly 7 p.m. The silver doors slid shut behind him with a soft, final click that echoed through the marble-floored corridor. Yesterday, the penthouse had been swarming with heavily armed men, a paranoid fortress bracing for a volatile, bloody explosion. Tonight, the heavy mahogany double doors leading to the medical suite were already propped wide open, and the hallway was eerily quiet. Only 2 guards stood outside the entrance. Marcus, the massive enforcer from the previous day, gave Leo a look that was caught somewhere between profound respect and a preemptive eulogy. He cleared the room. Marcus murmured under his breath as Leo approached, his eyes darting nervously toward the open doors. "Sent the inside detail down to the lobby 10 minutes ago. It's just you 2 in there tonight. Watch your step, Doc. He's in a mood we haven't seen before." Leo's grip on his leather medical bag tightened for a fraction of a second, but his expression remained a carefully constructed mask of professional calm. Noted. He walked past the guards and stepped into the expansive suite. The room was bathed in the warm, ambient glow of the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the glittering nighttime skyline of the city he ruthlessly controlled, was Julian Vance. He wasn't sitting on the therapy table, waiting like a patient this time. He was standing tall, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal gray dress shirt with the cuffs rolled up past his forearms, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid held loosely in his left hand. The moment Leo crossed the threshold, Julian turned. The alpha pheromones hit Leo instantly, but they were vastly different from the day before. Yesterday, the scent of dark cedar, crushed ozone, and gunpowder had been a chaotic, violent storm of defensive rage. Tonight, the scent was entirely deliberate. It was heavy, dark, and intoxicatingly rich, rolling across the expansive room like a physical, suffocating wave. It was designed to wrap around Leo, testing his edges, tasting his presence in the room. It was the scent of an apex predator who had stopped thrashing blindly and had finally locked onto a specific target. Leo forced his lungs to expand normally. Every Omega instinct in his cellular makeup was suddenly screaming at him, a frantic, ancient hum in his blood telling him to lower his eyes, bare his throat, and submit to the overwhelming, crushing power in the room. He clamped down on that biological betrayal with a steel trap of sheer willpower. "You're exactly on time," Julian's deep, gravelly baritone cut through the silence. It wasn't a compliment. It was a slow, calculated observation, spoken as his piercing gray eyes tracked Leo's every movement across the floor. "Punctuality is part of the job description," Leo replied smoothly, walking over to the pristine metal tray and setting his bag down. He didn't look at Julian as he began to deliberately unpack his specialized oils and fresh heat packs. "I see you dismissed your audience. I prefer a quiet working environment, but you should know I don't respond well to intimidation tactics, Mr. Vance." Julian took a slow sip from his tumbler, the ice clinking softly in the quiet room. "If I wanted to intimidate you, Omega, you wouldn't be standing upright right now. I sent them away because they're a distraction, and because what happens on that table tonight is no longer their business." The words hung in the air, heavy with a dangerous double meaning that made the fine hairs on the back of Leo's neck stand up. He ignored the implication, keeping his face blank as he turned on the small digital heater for his hydrocollator packs. "Take your shirt off and lie face down," Leo instructed, his voice even and unapologetically commanding. Julian didn't sneer, argue, or resist like he had the previous day. He set his glass down on a glass-topped side table. With slow, calculated movements, he began to unbutton his shirt with his left hand. Leo watched him from the corner of his eye, unable to look away despite himself. Despite the horrific scarring that mangled his right shoulder and cascaded down his spine, Julian Vance's body was a breathtaking sculpture of lethal, coiled power. Broad, thick shoulders, a narrow waist, and dense, heavily tattooed muscle that spoke of a lifetime of brutality and survival. Julian discarded the expensive shirt, letting it fall carelessly to the floor, and lay face down on the black leather of the therapy table. Leo approached. He didn't hesitate this time. He retrieved a steaming hot pack, wrapped it securely in a thick white towel, and placed it directly over the darkest, thickest knot of scar tissue near Julian's spine. The alpha's massive back muscles jumped at the sudden contact, a sharp flinch of memory, but he didn't violently lock up like yesterday. His breathing hitched sharply, then leveled out into a slow, measured, heavy rhythm. He was anticipating the pain, preparing for the intrusion, but he was allowing it. He was giving Leo access. "Your response time is already better," Leo murmured, analyzing the subtle shifting of the tissue beneath the heated towel. "Yesterday, your central nervous system treated my touch as an active, hostile threat. Today, it's only bracing for impact. That's a significant psychological progression." "I'm not bracing for the heat," Julian muttered, his voice vibrating darkly against the leather headrest. Leo paused, his hands hovering over the alpha's back. "Then what are you bracing for?" Julian turned his head slightly, resting his scarred cheek against his forearm so he could look up at Leo with one dark, intense gray eye. "You." The single word felt like a physical strike against Leo's chest. His pulse hammered against his ribs in a sudden, frantic rhythm, but he expertly hid it behind a clinical nod. He let the silence stretch for a few minutes, allowing the heat to penetrate the damaged fascia. Then, he removed the hot pack and set it aside. He poured the specialized friction oil into his palms, rubbed them together to generate heat, and stepped right up against the edge of the table, his thighs brushing the metal frame. He placed his bare hands on Julian's ruined back. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight up Leo's arms. The heat radiating off the alpha's skin was intense, feverish. Leo began his work, pressing his thumbs deep into the fibrous, hardened tissue that had trapped the Mafia boss in agony for nearly a decade. He moved with slow, agonizing, deliberate pressure, tracing the jagged lines of the burned scars, physically breaking down the microscopic adhesions in the muscle. Julian's hands gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. A low, rumbling growl vibrated deep in his chest, an involuntary alpha sound of distress, endurance, and raw aggression. "Breathe, Julian," Leo commanded softly, shifting his own body weight forward to apply more leverage, his forearms flexing with the effort. "Don't fight me. Let the muscle melt. You have to let go of the defense. It hurts like absolute hell." Julian ground out between violently clenched teeth, his massive frame trembling slightly under the Omega's unyielding hands. "I know it does, but it's a clean pain. It's a pain that leads to motion." Leo's thumbs dug into a particularly brutal, twisted not just beneath the right shoulder blade. "This is the epicenter of the lock. Hold on." Leo applied maximum pressure. Julian sharply inhaled, his entire body going rigid. In an instant, the room flooded with a suffocating, crushing wave of alpha pheromones. It was a biological reflex, a dominant predator trying to establish ultimate control over his environment when subjected to intense pain. The pressure in the air was so immensely heavy it felt like the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. The scent of dark cedar turned sharp, aggressive, and completely overwhelming. Leo's breath caught hard in his throat. His knees actually buckled for a fraction of a second as his internal Omega biology screamed at him to drop to the floor, to yield, to stop hurting the alpha, and submit to his absolute authority. His hands trembled wildly, and an overwhelming wave of submissive, dizzying heat flushed across his skin. "No." Leo gritted his teeth, his jaw locking in an expression of pure, stubborn defiance. He forced his legs to straighten, locking his knees. He refused to break the physical contact. He pushed back against the suffocating, terrifying aura with pure, unadulterated willpower. He didn't have alpha strength, he didn't have the size, but his mind was an unbreakable fortress. "I said let it go," Leo whispered fiercely, his voice shaking but laced with absolute command as he leaned his entire body weight into his thumbs. Julian let out a sharp, breathless gasp, and suddenly, the knot gave way. The warped muscle physically popped beneath Leo's hands, releasing an incredible flood of trapped, stagnant tension. Simultaneously, the crushing pheromone pressure in the room snapped, vanishing as quickly as it had violently erupted. Julian slumped flat against the table, his broad chest heaving with deep, ragged, desperate breaths. He was drenched in a fine layer of sweat, his rigid posture entirely broken. Leo stood over him, his own chest rising and falling rapidly as he desperately tried to regulate his own breathing and calm his racing heart. His hands were still planted firmly on Julian's back, feeling the sudden, dramatic, incredible softness of the muscle that had been like solid stone just seconds before. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound in the penthouse was the ragged, exhausted breathing of the two men. Then, Julian began to laugh. It was a low, dark, rough sound that started deep in his chest and echoed strangely in the quiet room. He pushed himself up onto his left elbow, completely ignoring the lingering sting in his right shoulder, and turned his body to look fully at Leo. His gray eyes were wild, dilated, and fixated entirely on the Omega standing before him. "You are magnificent," Julian breathed, the words carrying a terrifying weight of awe and a very dark, very real intent. "I pushed my scent on you hard enough to bring a grown, armed alpha enforcer to his knees begging for air, and you didn't even lower your chin." Leo grabbed a clean white towel and wiped the oil from his hands, rubbing the fabric harshly against his skin, desperately trying to keep his fingers from visibly shaking. "I'm a medical professional. I don't respond to biological bullying. Your parlor tricks don't work on me." Julian slowly pushed himself up to a full sitting position. He rolled his right shoulder. The range of motion was noticeably wider. The sharp, agonizing catch that usually stopped him cold was dulled to a mere ache. He stared at his own arm in utter disbelief for a fleeting second, the reality of healing hitting him. Then his intense gaze snapped right back to Leo. He stood up. Julian was 6'4". Leo was 5'10". When Julian stepped closer, the sheer physical disparity was glaringly, dangerously obvious. The alpha didn't stop walking until he was mere inches from Leo, completely invading his personal space, effectively trapping the Omega between the solid, immovable wall of Julian's chest and the steel edge of the therapy table. The scent of dark cedar wrapped around Leo again, but this time it wasn't a violent test of dominance. It was a claim. It was warm, thick, heavy, and deeply, terrifyingly possessive. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had to tilt his head up to maintain eye contact, but he absolutely refused to step back. "Why don't you submit?" Julian asked, his voice dropping a full octave, slipping into a low, rumbling, chest-deep purr that sent an involuntary shiver straight down Leo's spine. "Every instinct inside of your body is screaming at you to yield to me right now. I can smell it on your skin. I can hear your heart rate. But you choose to stand there and look me right in the eye. Why?" Leo held his ground, though his skin was burning feverishly where the ambient heat of Julian's massive body brushed against his clothing. "Because biology is a suggestion, Julian, not a mandate. And if I yield to you, if I let you scare me, I can't heal you." Julian stared down at him, his dark eyes slowly tracing the sharp line of Leo's jaw, mapping the rapid pulse fluttering at the base of his throat. He slowly raised his large left hand. His calloused fingers hovered just a millimeter over the sensitive skin of Leo's neck, right over his scent gland. He didn't touch him, but the phantom heat of the gesture was completely electrifying, a silent threat and a promise all at once. "Most people look at me and see a monster," Julian murmured, his gaze darkening with an obsession that had just violently taken root deep in his chest. "You look at me and see a challenge." "I see a patient," Leo corrected, his voice trembling just a fraction of an inch, betraying his iron facade. Julian's mouth curved into a slow, incredibly dangerous smile. "Liar." He finally stepped back, the loss of proximity hitting Leo like a cold draft. Julian reached down and picked up his discarded shirt from the floor. The suffocating tension broke, leaving Leo feeling entirely dizzy and breathless. "We are making progress," Julian said, slipping his arm smoothly into the sleeve, his tone suddenly reverting back to the cold, calculating, untouchable mafia boss. "But you are not to treat anyone else in your clinic while you are working on me. Do you understand?" Leo frowned deeply, his professional irritation finally overriding his biological panic. "Excuse me? I have other clients, Mr. Vance. You bought my evenings, you didn't buy my practice. I have people who rely on me." Julian walked over to the heavy mahogany doors, pausing with his hand resting lightly on the brass handle. He looked back over his shoulder, his cold gray eyes flashing with absolute, unyielding authority. "I bought you, Leo," Julian stated calmly, the sudden, sharp use of his first name sending a massive jolt through the quiet room. "No one else gets your hands. No one else gets your time. Cancel your other appointments, or I will have my men cancel them for you permanently. I will see you tomorrow." With that, Julian walked out, the heavy doors closing softly behind him, leaving Leo standing completely alone in the penthouse. His heart was racing, his hands were sweating, and he realized with terrifying clarity that he was now trapped in a dangerous, deadly new game where the rules had just been completely rewritten. End of Part 2. Part 3. The morning sun usually brought a sense of peace to Leo Brooks's private clinic, but today, the sunlight spilling through the frosted glass windows felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Leo arrived at his practice at 8 a.m., holding a cup of black coffee and carrying a mind full of exhausting, chaotic thoughts. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the heavy, suffocating scent of dark cedar and the phantom heat of Julian Vance's massive frame invaded his senses. He had tried to convince himself that Julian's threat last night was just posturing, an alpha throwing his weight around to maintain control. He was wrong. When Leo unlocked the front door and stepped into his serene, minimalist waiting room, he stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting in one of the pale blue waiting chairs, looking absurdly out of place among the potted ferns and soft ambient music, was Marcus. The giant, heavily tattooed mafia enforcer was wearing a sharp black suit, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Standing by the front entrance, blocking the door from the inside, was another guard Leo recognized from the penthouse. "What the hell is this?" Leo demanded, his voice dropping into a furious, hushed whisper. Marcus stood up, offering a polite, entirely humorless nod. "Morning, document." Just making sure the perimeter is secure. Secure from what? Elderly patients with sciatica. College athletes with torn ligaments. Leo stalked forward, setting his coffee down on the reception desk with a sharp thud. Get out. You can't be here. I have a full schedule today. Not anymore, you don't, Marcus said calmly, pulling a sleek tablet from his jacket pocket. Mr. Vance had our cyber division access your clinic's booking system at 3 in the morning. Every appointment for the next month has been canceled. Full refunds were issued, along with a very generous compensation bonus for the inconvenience. Your receptionist, Sarah, was also given a 4-week paid vacation. She won't be coming in. Leo stared at the enforcer, his blood running completely cold. The sheer scale of the intrusion, the effortless way Julian had dismantled his professional life in a matter of hours, was terrifying. It wasn't just money, it was absolute, unchecked power. He hacked my system, Leo whispered, the realization settling like a stone in his stomach. He effectively shut down my business. He secured your undivided attention, Marcus corrected smoothly. The boss was explicitly clear. You don't burn your energy on anyone else. You don't use your hands on anyone else. From this moment on, you are the exclusive, private property of the Vance Syndicate. Your compensation has already been wired to your personal account. Leo pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly with a potent mixture of rage and panic. He opened his banking app. A string of zeros stared back at him. A sum of money so obscenely large it made his breath catch. It was enough to buy his clinic building 3 times over. I am not for sale, Leo ground out, his Omega instincts violently warring between the urge to flee and the fury of being caged. With all due respect, Leo, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a tone of genuine, quiet warning. Everyone is for sale. And even if you weren't, Julian Vance doesn't ask for permission. If you try to open these doors today, we will turn your patients away. If you call the police, the responding officers will be on our payroll. Do not fight this. You survived 2 nights in that penthouse. Don't ruin it by being stubborn now. Leo looked at the heavily armed men standing in his quiet sanctuary. He was trapped. The golden cage had been locked from the outside. He spent the entire day pacing his empty clinic, practically vibrating with nervous energy and simmering anger. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, Leo wasn't just ready for his session with Julian. He was ready for a war. The 75th floor of the Vance Tower felt different tonight. When Leo stepped off the elevator, the guards in the hallway didn't just watch him. They lowered their heads slightly, a subtle, primal gesture of deference. They didn't see him as a medical professional anymore. They saw him as something belonging to the Alpha. Leo pushed the heavy mahogany doors open without knocking. Julian was standing in the center of the dimly lit medical suite. He was already shirtless, his back turned to the door, staring out at the darkening city. The muscles of his shoulders and back were tense, mapping out the horrific landscape of burned scars and warped tissue. Before Leo even took a full step into the room, his enhanced Omega senses caught something sharp in the air. Beneath the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of Julian's dark cedar pheromones, there was a faint, metallic tang. Blood. Leo's steps faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked closer. Julian's knuckles on his right hand were split and bruised, a fresh smear of crimson staining the pale skin. The Mafia boss hadn't just been waiting, he had been working. And Julian's line of work was brutal. Julian turned slowly. His cold, calculating gray eyes locked onto Leo. He looked lethal. The aura around him was thrumming with residual violence, the predatory hum of an alpha who had just destroyed something and was still riding the adrenaline high. You cleared my schedule, Leo said, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about the danger. He was furious. Julian's gaze dragged lazily down Leo's body, taking in the flushed cheeks, the rapid rise and fall of his chest, and the absolute fire in his eyes. The Alpha's lips curved into a dark, incredibly arrogant smirk. I bought your schedule, Julian corrected, his deep voice practically vibrating through the floorboards. I told you yesterday, Leo. I don't share. You don't own me. Leo snapped, dropping his medical bag onto the metal tray with a loud crash. He marched right up to the massive Alpha, completely ignoring the screaming alarms in his biological makeup. You cannot just by my life, isolate me from my patients, and expect me to bow down and thank you. Julian didn't step back. Instead, he stepped forward, instantly erasing the distance between them. The sheer heat radiating off his body was overwhelming. The metallic scent of fresh blood mixed intoxicatingly with his dark pheromones, creating a suffocating, dizzying cloud of absolute dominance. Julian leaned down, his face mere inches from Leo's. "I can, and I did," he murmured, his voice a dangerous, silken threat. "Your clinic is closed. Your time is mine. Your hands are mine. If you want to yell at me, Omega, you can do it while you fix my shoulder. Now do your job." Leo's jaw locked. He wanted to scream. He wanted to walk out. But as he looked up into those storm-gray eyes, he saw a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of genuine exhaustion underneath the violent facade. The man was in agony, both physically and mentally, drowning in a world of blood and betrayal, and Leo was the only lifeline he had allowed himself in 8 years. "Lie down," Leo ordered, his voice cold and clipped. Julian's smirk deepened, clearly pleased by the fiery defiance, but he complied. He lay face down on the leather table. Leo didn't bother with the hot packs tonight. He was running on pure adrenaline and anger. He poured the friction oil onto his hands and immediately dug his thumbs directly into the most damaged, stubborn knot of scar tissue near the base of Julian's neck. He pushed hard, harder than he ever had before. Julian let out a sharp, breathless grunt. His massive hands instantly gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. The muscles in his back flared, trying to violently reject the intrusion, but Leo didn't back off. He used his anger, channeling his frustration into an unrelenting, brutal pressure that forced the locked fibers to stretch and tear. "You think you can control everything," Leo muttered fiercely, leaning his body weight into his hands, sliding his thumbs down the deep groove of the alpha's spine. "You think because you can terrify people, you can manipulate the world to fit your paranoid little box." Julian's breathing grew harsh and ragged. The pain had to be blinding, yet he didn't command Leo to stop. In fact, a dark, vibrating purr began to rumble deep in his chest. He was leaning into the pain. He was craving the rough, unforgiving touch. "I manipulate the world," Julian ground out, his voice strained but laced with dark amusement. "Because if I don't, it tries to kill me. The men who did this to me, they thought they broke me. They thought I would spend the rest of my life as a crippled king on a rotting throne." Leo's thumbs hit a jagged ridge of scar tissue. He pressed deep, finding the trapped nerve underneath. "And instead, you just became a monster to survive it." "Exactly," Julian hissed as the muscle beneath Leo's hands suddenly popped, releasing a massive wave of tension. The physical release was instantaneous. Julian's entire body went limp against the table, a shuddering exhale escaping his lips. But as the physical tension vanished, the air in the room suddenly grew incredibly dense. The pheromones shifted violently. The scent of dark cedar became overwhelmingly rich, sweet, and intoxicatingly heavy. Leo froze. His hands were still slick with oil, resting flat against Julian's burning skin. It wasn't a dominance display. It was an arousal spike. Julian's biology was reacting to the profound relief of the chronic pain, crossing the wires between physical healing and profound primal attachment. The alpha scent was practically wrapping around Leo's throat, a heavy, velvet snare that sent a massive jolt of submissive heat straight to the Omega's core. Leo's breath hitched, his vision blurring slightly at the edges as his own body instinctively tried to answer the alpha's call. "Julian," Leo whispered, his voice trembling slightly, trying to pull his hands away. Before Leo could break contact, Julian moved with terrifying speed. He pushed himself up off the table and spun around. His large, blood-stained hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Leo's wrist like an iron manacle. Leo gasped, stumbling forward slightly, his knees hitting the edge of the metal table. Julian didn't let go. He pulled Leo closer, until they were mere inches apart. The alpha's chest was heaving, his gray eyes blown completely black with blown pupils. The predator had entirely taken over. "Don't pull away," Julian ordered, his voice a raw, desperate growl that shook the air between them. "Don't you ever pull away from me. You're reacting to the endorphin rush," Leo breathed frantically, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to tug his wrist back, but Julian's grip was absolute. "Your nervous system is flooded. Let go of me, Julian." "No," Julian whispered, lifting his other hand. His calloused, bruised fingers brushed lightly against Leo's cheek, tucking a stray lock of hair behind his ear. The touch was agonizingly gentle, a stark, terrifying contrast to the brutal violence the man was capable of. "I spent 8 years in a cage of my own making, untouchable and rotting. And then you walked in. You put your hands on me, and the cage broke." Julian's thumb traced the line of Leo's jaw, stopping dangerously close to the sensitive, pulsing scent gland at his neck. "You aren't just treating me anymore, Leo," Julian murmured, the dark obsession fully cementing itself in his eyes. "You're tethering me, and I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone take you away from me." Leo stared up at the mafia boss, entirely consumed by the overwhelming scent of cedar, blood, and possessive devotion. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had been locked, and Julian Vance had swallowed the key. End of Part 3. Part 4. The air inside the penthouse suite was no longer just heavy. It was a physical weight, pressing down on Leo's chest with the force of a collapsing building. Julian Vance's hand was a brutal, unyielding cuff around Leo's wrist, while his other hand hovered agonizingly close to the Omega's scent gland. "You aren't just treating me anymore, Leo." Julian's voice was a dark, gravelly vibration that resonated straight through Leo's bones. "You're tethering me, and I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone take you away from me." Every single medical textbook Leo had ever studied, every psychological profile on alpha/omega trauma bonding he had ever read, screamed at him to de-escalate, to step back, to inject a sterile, clinical distance into the space between them. But looking up into Julian's blown-out, pitch-black pupils, Leo knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that textbooks meant absolutely nothing in the face of a primal claiming. "Julian," Leo breathed, his voice betraying a slight tremor that he violently cursed himself for. "You are experiencing a massive adrenaline and endorphin dump. Your nervous system has been locked in a state of chronic agony for 8 years. The sudden absence of that pain is short-circuiting your logic centers. You are confusing biological relief with attachment." Julian's thumb finally brushed against the sensitive skin of Leo's neck, right over the racing pulse of his carotid artery. The jolt of electricity that shot through Leo's system was so intense it made his breath catch sharply. "Do not insult my intelligence by diagnosing my instincts, Omega," Julian murmured, stepping even closer, his broad, bare chest brushing against Leo's shirt. The scent of cedar and fresh blood was completely intoxicating. "I have survived in a world of cutthroats, assassins, and traitors because my instincts are flawless. I know exactly what I am feeling, and I know exactly what you are feeling." Julian leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of Leo's ear. "Your heart is beating so fast I can feel it against my own ribs. Your scent is spiking. You smell like honey and sheer panic, but you aren't pulling away. You're fighting your own biology just to prove a point." "I am a professional," Leo gasped out, planting his free hand flat against Julian's chest to put some semblance of space between them. The alpha's skin was burning hot, the heavy slabs of muscle completely relaxed under his palm. "You are mine," Julian corrected effortlessly. Before Leo could formulate a response to the terrifyingly absolute statement, the atmosphere in the room shattered. It didn't happen with a loud explosion or a dramatic crash. It happened with a sound that was far worse to the men of the Vance Syndicate. A low, piercing electronic whine sliced through the penthouse, followed instantly by the ambient lighting shifting from warm gold to a stark, blood-red emergency glow. Julian's head snapped up. In less than a fraction of a second, the intoxicating, possessive alpha melted away, entirely replaced by the cold, lethal apex predator who ruled the city's underground. He released Leo's wrist and spun around just as the heavy mahogany doors were violently shoved open. Marcus burst into the room, a heavy assault rifle already gripped in his massive hands, his face pale and tight with pure adrenaline. 3 other heavily armed enforcers filed in instantly behind him, forming a tactical wall between the doorway and Julian. "Boss," Marcus barked, his eyes scanning the glass windows frantically. "Perimeter breach. Sector 4, sublevel access. Someone bypassed the outer security grid." "How?" Julian demanded, his voice entirely devoid of the raw emotion from seconds ago. It was a freezing, absolute command. "They cloned an executive access card," Marcus replied, moving swiftly to the control panel on the wall and tapping rapidly. Heavy steel shutters began to descend over the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing the penthouse off from the city skyline. They didn't make it past the secondary checkpoint. My men intercepted them in the service corridor. 3 casualties on our side, but the intruder is dead. Leo stood frozen by the therapy table, his heart hammering against his ribs in a completely new kind of terror. 3 casualties. Men were dying downstairs, right now, while he was standing here holding a bottle of massage oil. The reality of Julian Vance's world came crashing down on him like an avalanche. Julian didn't blink. He walked over to the discarded black shirt on the floor, picked it up, and threw it over his scarred shoulders. Identify the body. Now. We did, Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly, a heavy grimness settling over the room. It was a ghost, boss. No prints, no dental, no facial recognition hits. But he had something on him. Marcus reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small, heavy silver coin. He tossed it through the air. Julian caught it flawlessly with his left hand. The Alpha stared down at the object in his palm. The silence in the room grew so dense it was suffocating. Leo watched as Julian's jaw locked, a muscle ticking furiously in his cheek. The dark cedar pheromones flooding the room instantly turned violently sour, reeking of ozone, gunpowder, and pure, unadulterated rage. He's alive, Julian whispered. The words were quiet, but they carried a weight of malice, so profound it made Marcus take a subtle half-step backward. It's his calling card, boss, Marcus confirmed grimly. Antoniov. Leo recognized the name instantly, not from his time here, but from the hushed, terrified whispers of the city's news cycles nearly a decade ago. Antoniov was the rival syndicate leader, the man entirely responsible for the car bomb that had nearly ripped Julian to shreds 8 years ago. Everyone thought he had burned to ash in the retaliatory strike Julian had ordered from his hospital bed. He sent a ghost into my tower, Julian said, his eyes still locked on the silver coin. Not to kill me. He knows a single man couldn't reach the penthouse. Then why? Marcus asked. Julian slowly looked up. His terrifying, cold gray eyes bypassed his heavily armed enforcers and locked directly onto Leo. To leave a message, Julian stated softly. He was testing the response time. He's watching. Julian crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between himself and Leo before the Omega could even process the movement. He didn't grab Leo roughly this time. Instead, his large hand splayed wide against the small of Leo's back, a heavy, protective weight that instantly anchored the trembling physical therapist. Marcus, Julian ordered without breaking eye contact with Leo. Lock down the tower. Nobody enters, nobody leaves. Double the guard on the medical wing, and move my personal detail to the inner vault. Yes, boss. Julian looked down at Leo, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. Grab your bag. What? Leo stammered, the chaotic whiplash of the last 5 minutes making his head spin. Julian, you just had a major tissue release. If you flood your system with stress hormones right now, the muscle memory will cause the fascia to seize up worse than before. You need to rest. Grab your bag, Julian repeated, the command absolute and leaving zero room for argument. You are no longer safe in this wing. I'm not part of this. Leo shot back, his fear manifesting as defiance. I'm a doctor. If your old enemies are coming out of the woodwork, let me go home. I don't belong in a mob war. Julian's hand slid from the small of Leo's back up to the nape of his neck, his thumb resting heavily against the rapidly beating pulse point. The Alpha leaned down, his voice dropping into a deadly, intimate whisper that only Leo could hear over the blaring security alarms. Do you think Antoniov gives a damn about your medical license? Julian breathed, his eyes flashing with a terrifying possessiveness. He knows I haven't let anyone touch me in 8 years. He knows you are here. In his eyes, you aren't a doctor, Leo. You are my weakness, and he will use you to tear me apart. The truth of it hit Leo like a physical blow. The golden cage hadn't just been locked, it had been painted with a massive bullseye. You belong to me, Julian stated, his voice a vow of absolute protection and unrelenting dominance. And what is mine I protect. You are moving into my personal quarters. Now, before Leo could protest, Julian physically guided him forward. The enforcers instantly fell into a tight diamond formation around them. They moved out of the medical suite and down a hidden, reinforced corridor Leo hadn't even known existed. The luxury of the penthouse gave way to thick steel blast doors and biometric scanners. They stepped into Julian's private inner sanctum, a massive, sprawling bedroom encased in solid steel and concrete, a fortress within a fortress. The heavy vault doors hissed shut behind them, sealing with a series of heavy mechanical clunks that sounded terrifyingly permanent. The guards remained outside. They were completely alone in the dim, silent room. The moment the doors locked, the lethal, untouchable mafia boss suddenly faltered. Julian let out a sharp, ragged hiss, his left hand flying up to grip his right shoulder. The massive spike of adrenaline and the stress of the security breach had done exactly what Leo had warned him about. The scarred muscles, traumatized and overwhelmed, violently seized up in defense. Julian stumbled forward, his knees buckling slightly as a blinding wave of chronic, agonizing pain washed over him. He caught himself on the edge of a massive dark oak dresser, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wood, his breathing instantly turning harsh and shallow. Leo dropped his bag to the floor. The fear, the anger, the panic of the Mafia war. It all vanished in a fraction of a second, entirely replaced by the deeply ingrained instincts of a healer. He rushed forward, placing his hands on Julian's trembling back. The muscle under the shirt felt like jagged concrete again. "I told you," Leo said softly, his voice devoid of any "I told you so" arrogance, filled only with a deep, profound empathy that cut right through Julian's defenses. Julian hung his head, a low groan vibrating in his throat. He was an apex predator, the most dangerous man in the city, but right now, trapped in his steel vault, he was broken, bleeding, and entirely at the mercy of the Omega standing behind him. "Fix it," Julian whispered hoarsely, a quiet desperation bleeding into his dominant tone. "Please, Leo." It was the first time Julian Vance had ever said the word please. Leo didn't hesitate. He gently grasped the collar of Julian's shirt, pulling it slowly off his shoulders. The air in the vault was thick with cedar and raw vulnerability. The outside world was burning, enemies were circling the gates, but in this room, the only thing that mattered was the brutal, undeniable bond forging itself in the fire. "Sit on the edge of the bed," Leo commanded softly, his hands already warming up the friction oil. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." End of Part 4. Part 5. The vault was entirely devoid of the city's ambient noise. Encased in reinforced steel and thick, sound-dampening concrete, Julian Vance's inner sanctum felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. There were no sirens, no city lights, no blaring security alarms. Only the harsh, ragged sound of the Alpha's breathing and the frantic, echoing thud of Leo's own heartbeat. The room was massive, dominated by a heavy, dark oak king-sized bed draped in charcoal sheets. But Leo didn't have time to take in the luxurious, imposing decor. His entire focus was completely zeroed in on the man sitting on the edge of the mattress. Julian's broad back was a tragic canvas of violently locked muscle. The psychological trigger of Antoniov's name had undone days of painstaking progress in a matter of seconds. His body had instantly reverted to its deepest trauma response, anticipating the blinding flash of the car bomb, the tearing of metal, and the searing heat of the fire. Leo poured the friction oil directly into his palms, rubbing them together quickly. His hands were trembling, but the moment his skin made contact with Julian's burning flesh, his professional instincts entirely overrode his biological panic. "Julian, listen to the sound of my voice," Leo commanded, his tone dropping into a steady, rhythmic cadence. He bypassed the superficial tissue entirely, pressing the heels of his hands firmly against the rigid columns of muscle flanking Julian's spine. "You are not in the car. You are not bleeding. You are in your vault, and I am right here." Julian let out a sharp, guttural hiss. His massive hands gripped the heavy dark wood of the bed frame, his knuckles turning stark white. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The phantom pain was absolute, dragging his mind back 8 years into the fire. Leo shifted his stance, stepping directly between Julian's spread knees to get better leverage. The proximity was incredibly intimate, their bodies mere inches apart, but Leo ignored the blinding spike of alpha pheromones flooding the air. "Your body is trying to protect you from an explosion that already happened," Leo said softly, increasing the pressure of his thumbs, digging mercilessly into the epicenter of the fibrous, not on Julian's right shoulder blade. "But you survived it. You walked out of the fire, Julian. Tell your body it's over. Tell it you won." Julian's chest heaved, a bead of cold sweat running down his scarred temple. They locked the doors," the Mafia boss grated out, his voice a fractured, unrecognizable rasp. It wasn't the voice of the Untouchable syndicate head. It was the voice of a man reliving his own murder. The heat, it melted the locks. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He had read the medical file, but hearing the raw, unfiltered truth of the assassination attempt was a completely different horror. Antoniov hadn't just blown up a car. He had trapped Julian inside a burning armored vehicle. "I know," Leo murmured, his heart aching with a profound, sudden grief for the man beneath his hands. He didn't pull away. He leaned closer, his chest brushing against Julian's back. "But you broke the glass. You broke the cage. Focus on my hands, Julian. Focus on the pressure." Leo applied a brutal, downward sweep along the deepest burn scar. Julian inhaled sharply, his entire frame shuddering violently against the mattress. For 3 agonizing seconds, the muscle resisted with the strength of solid iron. Then, accompanied by a low, devastating groan from the alpha, the tissue snapped. The physical release was massive. The locked fascia melted beneath Leo's palms like wax held to a flame. Julian's rigid posture entirely collapsed. He slumped forward, his heavy head coming to rest directly against Leo's stomach, his broad shoulders dropping as the agonizing nerve lock finally surrendered. Leo froze. The Mafia boss was leaning his entire weight against the Omega, his face buried in the soft cotton of Leo's shirt. The sheer vulnerability of the gesture was staggering. Julian Vance, a man who ruled a criminal empire with absolute ruthlessness, a man who hadn't let another living soul touch him in nearly a decade, was currently using Leo Brooks to hold himself upright. The air in the vault instantly shifted. The panicked, acidic scent of ozone and defensive rage dissolved, replaced by a suffocatingly rich, intoxicating wave of dark cedar and possessive warmth. Leo's hands slowly moved from Julian's back to rest gently on his broad shoulders. He should have stepped away. The crisis was over. The muscle was unlocked. But his Omega instincts, completely overwhelmed by the Alpha's surrender, anchored his feet to the floor. "Every time you touch me," Julian murmured, his voice muffled against Leo's chest, the vibration sending a direct, electric shock straight to Leo's core. "My body stops fighting." Leo's pulse fluttered wildly. That is the goal of physical therapy, Julian. To re-educate the nervous system." Julian slowly lifted his head, pulling back just enough to look up into Leo's eyes. His gray irises were incredibly dark, swirling with an emotion so intense, so consuming, it made it hard for Leo to draw a full breath. "No," Julian corrected quietly, his large hands shifting from the bed frame to lightly grip Leo's hips, holding him perfectly in place between his thighs. "That's dependence." The word hung in the quiet vault, heavy and dangerous. "You don't depend on anyone," Leo whispered, his voice failing him slightly under the sheer weight of Julian's stare. "I didn't," Julian agreed, his thumbs slowly, deliberately stroking the crests of Leo's hip bones through his slacks. "In my world, dependence is a death sentence. If someone knows what you need, they know exactly how to break you. Antoniov thought my weakness was my pride. He tried to burn me alive for it. But he was wrong." Julian slowly leaned forward again, not resting his head this time, but pressing his face perilously close to the crook of Leo's neck. The Alpha inhaled deeply, taking in the sweet, panicked, honey-laced scent of the Omega. "You are my weakness now, Leo," Julian breathed against the sensitive skin, his voice a dark, possessive rumble. "If I am not touching you, my body thinks it is dying. You haven't just re-educated my nervous system. You've completely hijacked it." Leo's knees trembled. The confession was terrifying. It wasn't just a declaration of desire. It was a biological absolute. The Alpha was claiming him, not just as a lover, but as a vital organ necessary for his own survival. "Julian, you can't say things like that," Leo gasped, his hands gripping Julian's bare shoulders, unsure if he was trying to push the Alpha away or hold him closer. "I am your doctor. This is a trauma bond. It isn't real." Julian moved so fast Leo didn't even have time to blink. The Alpha stood up, his massive frame instantly towering over Leo. He gripped Leo by the waist and effortlessly lifted him, spinning them around and pressing the Omega's back firmly against one of the thick, steel-reinforced concrete walls of the vault. "Do not ever tell me what is real in my own mind," Julian growled softly, stepping flush against Leo, effectively pinning him to the cold wall with the burning heat of his own chest. Leo gasped, his hands instinctively coming up to rest flat against Julian's chest. The Alpha's heart was hammering, a powerful, steady, furious rhythm against Leo's palms. "You think this is just a psychological side effect of a massage?" Julian demanded, his eyes practically black, his face inches from Leo's. "You think I brought you into my impenetrable vault, into my personal sanctuary, because of a medical contract? Look at me, Leo." Leo forced his eyes up, meeting the storm raging in Julian's gaze. "My men are dying in the hallways right now," Julian said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "My oldest enemy has risen from the dead to finish the job he started 8 years ago. My entire empire is standing on the edge of a bloody war. And the only thing I care about, the absolute only thing I am thinking about right now, is making sure you are locked in this room where no one else can ever look at you." The heavy, dominating scent of dark cedar washed over Leo like a tidal wave. His biology violently betrayed him. A sudden, intense spike of heat pooled in his lower stomach, and a soft, entirely involuntary sound of submission slipped past his lips. Julian's eyes flared at the sound. He raised his right hand, the hand connected to the shoulder that was supposed to be crippled, and slammed it flat against the steel wall right beside Leo's head. The movement was flawless. No hesitation, no lock, no pain. Julian didn't even notice the healing. He only noticed the Omega trapped beautifully beneath him. He leaned in, his lips hovering a millimeter above Leo's trembling mouth. "You belong to me," Julian vowed, a dark, absolute promise. "You are not leaving this tower. You are not going back to your old life. You are mine." Before Leo could gather the scattered, fragmented pieces of his professional resolve to fight back, a sharp, electronic buzz shattered the heavy silence. The intercom panel on the wall next to them flashed with a harsh red light. Julian froze. His jaw clenched so hard Leo heard the teeth grind together. The Alpha let out a slow, furious exhale, his hot breath washing over Leo's face, before he turned his head slightly and hit the comms button with a violently sharp strike of his knuckle. "This better be a matter of life and death, Marcus." Julian's voice was an icy, terrifying void. "It is, boss." Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker, strained and breathless. "The perimeter is secured, but we have a major problem. Antoniov just broadcasted a message on the underground encrypted frequency. Every family, every boss, every syndicate in the city heard it." Julian's eyes narrowed, the predator instantly returning to the surface. "What did he say?" "He told the city that the Vance syndicate is being run by a broken, crippled king," Marcus reported grimly. "He said you're too weak to lift a gun, let alone hold your territory. He's calling for a massive, coordinated strike on our northern supply lines tonight. He thinks you won't retaliate because your body is shattered." A terrifying, dead silence filled the vault. Leo watched as Julian slowly pushed himself off the wall. The Alpha stood perfectly straight. He rolled his right shoulder, once, twice. The movement was smooth, lethal, and entirely silent. The agonizing lock that had defined his existence for 8 years was completely gone. The tissue was healed. The cage was broken. A slow, incredibly dark, and utterly merciless smile spread across Julian Vance's face. "Tell the inner circle to arm up," Julian commanded the intercom, his voice vibrating with the promise of absolute carnage. "Prep the armored convoy. We are going to the northern supply lines." "Boss," Marcus hesitated. "If you show up there, it's going to be a bloodbath. Antoniov will have an army waiting." "I know," Julian replied softly. "I want them to see the crippled king." He cut the intercom. Julian turned back to Leo. The Alpha was terrifying to behold, a god of war stepping back onto the battlefield, unbound and unbreakable. He walked over to the bed, picked up a sleek black suit jacket, and slid it flawlessly over his broad shoulders. Leo stood frozen against the wall, his heart in his throat. "Julian." Julian paused at the heavy vault door. He looked back at the Omega, the cold, bloodthirsty violence in his eyes softening just a fraction, replaced by that dark, possessive obsession. "Do not leave this room," Julian ordered, his voice echoing in the concrete chamber. "My men will guard the door. When I come back, I will be covered in blood. And you are going to be right here, waiting for me." He didn't wait for a response. The heavy steel door hissed open, and Julian stepped out into the war zone, leaving Leo trapped in the suffocating silence of the Alpha's bedroom, completely aware that the line between doctor and possession had just been permanently erased. End of Part 5. Part 6. The silence in the vault was no longer a sanctuary. It was a sensory deprivation chamber that violently amplified every chaotic thought in Leo's head. He paced, 10 steps from the edge of the massive, dark oak bed to the reinforced steel of the vault door. Turn, 10 steps back. The heavy, intoxicating scent of dark cedar and ozone still clung to the air, a phantom reminder of the terrifying Alpha who had just declared absolute ownership over him. Leo rubbed his wrists, his skin still burning where Julian's calloused fingers had clamped down like iron shackles. He could still feel the ghost of the Mafia boss's chest pressing him into the concrete, the raw, unadulterated heat of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Leo walked over to the heavy vault door and placed his hands flat against the cold steel. He took a deep breath, trying to summon his clinical, professional detachment. He was Dr. Leo Brooks. He had a clinic. He had a life outside of this towering glass fortress. But the reality was sinking into his bones like lead. That life was gone. Julian Vance had burned it to the ground the moment he realized Leo was the only key to his physical salvation. Leo pressed the intercom button on the wall panel. It flashed a stark, quiet green. "Marcus," Leo said, his voice echoing slightly in the massive, empty room. There was a brief crackle of static before the giant enforcer's voice came through, sounding strained and surrounded by the chaotic noise of shouting men and ringing phones. "Document. You need something? Food. Water. I can have someone slide it through the secure port." "I need to know what is happening," Leo demanded, crossing his arms over his chest to stop his hands from shaking. "It's been 4 hours, Marcus. You locked the tower down." A heavy sigh filtered through the speaker. "The tower is secure. But the northern supply lines. Doc, it's a war zone. Antoniov sent a small army. 200 men, heavily armed. They expected to roll over our guys because they thought the boss was still crippled. They thought Julian couldn't lead from the front lines anymore." Leo's breath hitched. He knew exactly what Julian's body was capable of now. He was the one who had unlocked it. And they were wrong. Marcus's voice dropped, carrying a distinct note of primal, terrifying awe. "The boss didn't just show up. He walked right into the center of the ambush. I've been with the Vance Syndicate for 15 years, Leo. I've never seen him move like this. Even before the car bomb, he wasn't this fast. It's like watching a demon unchained. He's tearing them apart. The enemy is routing, but Julian isn't letting them retreat." Leo closed his eyes, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I did that," he thought, a terrifying mixture of guilt and dark, twisted pride blooming in his chest. He had taken a chained, agonizingly broken king and handed him back his sword. "Is he injured?" Leo asked, his healer instincts violently overriding his fear. "Can't tell. Comms are a mess," Marcus replied grimly. "Just stay put, document. Do not open that door for anyone but him. If Antoniov's ghosts breach the penthouse again, that vault is the only thing keeping you breathing." The intercom clicked off, plunging Leo back into the suffocating silence. He spent the next 2 hours entirely consumed by nervous energy. He found Julian's private ensuite bathroom, a sprawling masterpiece of black marble and slate, and began gathering supplies. Towels, a first aid kit he found perfectly stocked in the cabinets, a basin of warm water, and antiseptic. He arranged them neatly on the glass coffee table near the center of the vault. He needed to feel useful. He needed a medical objective to keep himself from spiraling into the terrifying reality of his new existence as a mafia boss's caged Omega. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the heavy mechanical locks of the vault door began to disengage. Clank. Hiss. Thud. Leo stood up instantly, his entire body going rigid. The massive steel door swung outward, dragging heavily against the floor. Julian Vance stepped into the room. The sight of him made the breath violently leave Leo's lungs. The pristine, expensive black suit jacket Julian had left wearing was completely ruined, torn at the shoulder and heavily stained with dark, wet crimson. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned, clinging to his chest with sweat and blood. His knuckles were split open, raw and bruised, and a thin trail of blood leaked from a cut high on his cheekbone. But it wasn't the blood that terrified Leo. It was the Alpha's eyes. They were completely blown out, the gray irises swallowed entirely by pitch-black pupils. He was radiating an aura of lethal, unhinged dominance, so heavy that the air in the room actually felt difficult to breathe. The scent of dark cedar was entirely eclipsed by the sharp, metallic reek of fresh blood, adrenaline, and gunpowder. He looked exactly like what Marcus had described, a monster unchained. Julian stepped fully into the vault. He reached out with a bloody hand and slammed the heavy steel door shut behind him. The locks engaged automatically, sealing them inside. He didn't move toward the bed. He didn't drop his weapons. He just stood by the door, staring at Leo with a dark, predatory intensity that made the Omega's knees physically tremble. Julian's chest was heaving, his breathing ragged. The adrenaline from the slaughter was still violently coursing through his veins, demanding an outlet. Every textbook Leo had ever studied warned against approaching an alpha in the immediate aftermath of a violent territorial defense. Their biology was flooded with aggression, their logic centers completely suppressed by instinct. An Omega in the presence of a blood-drunk alpha was supposed to lower their eyes, bare their neck, and make themselves as small and unthreatening as possible to avoid triggering a predatory response. Leo didn't do any of those things. He looked at the blood coating Julian's hands. He looked at the exhaustion hiding beneath the lethal adrenaline. And then he took a step forward. "You're bleeding," Leo said, his voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic storm raging in his own biology. Julian's head tilted fractionally, his black eyes tracking Leo's every movement like a wolf watching a lamb step into its jaws. "It isn't my blood," he rasped, his voice a gravelly, inhuman vibration. "Some of it is," Leo corrected softly, stopping 3 feet away from the towering, blood-soaked mafia boss. He didn't break eye contact. He refused to show fear. "You have a laceration on your cheek. Your knuckles are fractured, and your right shoulder is favoring a defensive posture. Take off the jacket, Julian." For a terrifying, agonizingly long moment, Julian didn't move. The air crackled with explosive tension. The Alpha's muscles were coiled so tight he looked like he might rip the steel door off its hinges, just for the hell of it. Then, Julian exhaled. It was a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire night's carnage. His eyes fluttered closed for a fraction of a second, the pitch-black pupils receding slightly to reveal the stormy gray beneath. The feral, bloodthirsty predator slowly stepped back, allowing the man to return. Julian shrugged off the ruined suit jacket, letting it fall to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. Leo closed the remaining distance between them. The sheer heat radiating off Julian's body was feverish. Leo reached out and gently grasped the edges of Julian's ruined shirt, pulling it carefully over his broad shoulders and tossing it aside. The massive landscape of Julian's scarred back was fully exposed, but Leo's eyes instantly went to the right shoulder, the joint that had been locked in agonizing paralysis for 8 years. Did it hold? Leo whispered, his fingers hovering just an inch above the hot, blood-speckled skin. "It held," Julian answered, his voice dropping into a dark, reverent murmur. He looked down at Leo, his expression softening into something incredibly vulnerable and terrifyingly possessive. "I drove a combat knife through a man's sternum with my right hand, Leo. I lifted him off his feet. There was no catch. There was no lock. I felt nothing but power." Leo swallowed hard. The casual admission of brutal murder should have sent him running for the hills. It should have disgusted him. But hearing the profound, life-altering relief in Julian's voice, knowing that he, Leo, had given this man his body back, sent a massive, shameful thrill of warmth straight to his Omega core. "Sit down," Leo commanded softly, guiding the massive Alpha toward the edge of the bed. Julian complied without a single word of protest. The undisputed ruler of the city's criminal underworld, a man who had just slaughtered an army without blinking, sat down obediently because the Omega told him to. Leo grabbed the warm basin of water and a clean white cloth from the table. He stood between Julian's spread knees, exactly like he had earlier that evening, but the dynamic had entirely shifted. Julian wasn't running from phantom pain anymore. He was grounded, anchored entirely by Leo's presence. Leo dipped the cloth into the warm water and gently pressed it to Julian's bruised, bloody knuckles. The Alpha hissed slightly at the sting of the antiseptic, but he didn't pull his hand away. Instead, Julian uncurled his massive fingers, allowing Leo to wipe away the blood and grime of the battlefield. "Antoniov wasn't there," Julian said quietly, watching Leo's delicate, precise hands work over his own brutalized ones. "He sent his lieutenants to test the waters. He sacrificed 200 of his own men just to see if the rumors of my weakness were true. And now he knows they aren't," Leo murmured, cleaning the deep split on Julian's middle knuckle. "Now he knows I am coming for his head," Julian corrected, his voice a dark vow. "But he also knows something else." Julian's clean, left hand suddenly reached up, his fingers wrapping gently but firmly around Leo's wrist, stopping the Omega's movements. Leo looked up, meeting the Alpha's intense gaze. "One of the ghosts who breached the penthouse earlier transmitted a data packet before my men killed him," Julian said, his gray eyes darkening with a terrifying, protective fury. "He accessed the security cameras in the medical wing. He saw you, Leo. He saw you put your hands on me. He saw the cage break." Leo's blood ran completely cold. The warm cloth slipped from his fingers, splashing into the basin. He knows who I am. He knows you are the reason I am healed," Julian said softly, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse jumping at Leo's wrist. "Which means Antoniov realizes that if he wants to cripple me again, he doesn't need a car bomb. He just needs to take you." The reality of the golden cage suddenly morphed into the reality of a fortified bunker. Leo wasn't just Julian's obsession. He was the most valuable, heavily targeted asset in an all-out mafia war. Julian stood up, seamlessly closing the inch of space between them. He wrapped his massive, powerful arms around Leo's waist, pulling the Omega flush against his bare, burning chest. Leo gasped at the sudden, overwhelming contact, his hands instinctively coming up to rest on Julian's broad shoulders. "You were angry earlier because I locked you in this tower," Julian murmured, burying his face in the soft crook of Leo's neck, inhaling deeply. The alpha's scent flared, no longer aggressive, but profoundly, deeply protective, wrapping around Leo like an impenetrable shield of dark cedar and warmth. "You thought I was taking your freedom, but I was keeping you alive." Julian's lips brushed directly over Leo's scent gland, sending a massive, paralyzing jolt of heat straight down Leo's spine. "You are the most heavily guarded secret in my empire now," Julian vowed, his breath hot against Leo's skin. "No one touches you. No one looks at you. You are mine, Leo, and I will drown this city in blood before I let anyone take you from me." Leo closed his eyes, his fingers curling tightly into the thick muscle of Julian's back. The trap was permanently sealed. And heaven help him, as the alpha held him tighter, Leo realized he no longer wanted to find the key. End of Part 6. Part 7. The reinforced steel vault was impenetrable to the morning sun, but Leo Brooks didn't need light to know that the world outside was irreversibly changed. He sat near the edge of the massive dark oak bed, bathed only in the soft, warm glow of a single bedside lamp. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the deep, rhythmic breathing of the man lying asleep beside him. Julian Vance, the undisputed, terrifying head of the city's underground, was deeply unconscious. For a man who had spent the last 8 years sleeping with one eye open, perpetually locked in a cage of chronic agony and paranoid vigilance, this level of deep sleep was nothing short of a medical miracle. He was lying flat on his stomach, the heavy charcoal sheets pooled at his narrow waist, leaving his broad, heavily scarred back exposed to the cool air of the bunker. Leo watched him, his own exhaustion warring with a frantic, wired energy. The adrenaline from the night before, the blood, the gunfire, the terrifying realization that he was now the primary target in a mafia war, refused to completely leave his system. He looked at Julian's right shoulder. The massive network of jagged, thick-burned tissue was bruised and violently flushed from the sheer physical trauma of the ambush, but the structural alignment was entirely different. The shoulder blade sat flat. The warped, iron-like cables of muscle had melted into their proper anatomical positions. The physical lock was broken. Leo's fingers twitched. The healer inside him, the meticulous physical therapist who had built a career on fixing the impossible, couldn't resist. He moved closer, his knee sinking into the plush mattress, and gently placed his palm flat against the center of Julian's spine. The alpha's skin was incredibly hot, radiating a raw, feverish heat as his body desperately tried to repair the micro-tears from slaughtering 200 men. The moment Leo's hand made contact, Julian's breathing hitched. The alpha's reaction was instantaneous and entirely feral. In a fraction of a second, Julian's left arm snapped out, his large hand clamping around Leo's wrist with bone-crushing force. Julian twisted, flipping his massive body over and pulling Leo down simultaneously. Leo let out a sharp gasp as he hit the mattress, his back bouncing against the soft sheets. Before he could even blink, Julian was hovering over him, his heavy frame caging the Omega completely. The alpha's eyes snapped open. They were wild, dilated, and devoid of humanity. The eyes of a predator waking up in a war zone, ready to kill whatever had dared to touch him. The air in the vault instantly violently spiked with the suffocating, aggressive scent of crushed cedar and dark ozone. "Julian," Leo choked out, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He forced himself to go entirely still, suppressing every instinct that told him to thrash or fight. He bared his neck slightly, an involuntary biological surrender to the overwhelming dominance pressing down on him. "It's me. Julian, look at me." For 2 terrifying seconds, Julian didn't recognize him. The grip on Leo's wrist tightened to the point of acute pain. Then the alpha inhaled. The frantic, honey-laced scent of the Omega hit Julian's senses, cutting through the combat adrenaline like a blade through silk. Julian froze. The pitch-black pupils rapidly shrank, the storm-gray irises bleeding back into existence. Recognition washed over his sharp features, immediately followed by a profound, shuddering wave of horror. Julian released Leo's wrist, as if the Omega's skin had suddenly caught fire. He pushed himself back, sitting up on his knees, his broad chest heaving as he stared at the red marks his fingers had just left on Leo's pale skin. "I'm sorry," Julian rasped, his voice raw and entirely stripped of its usual absolute authority. He ran a shaking hand through his dark hair, looking entirely disgusted with himself. I didn't. I thought we were breached. I didn't know it was you. Leo sat up slowly, rubbing his wrist. It throbbed, but nothing was broken. He looked at the Mafia boss, seeing past the lethal reputation to the fractured, traumatized man underneath. I shouldn't have touched you while you were in a REM cycle, Leo said calmly, shifting his professional mask back into place to anchor them both. Your central nervous system is still heavily flooded with cortisol and adrenaline from the ambush. Your startle reflex is completely uninhibited. It's a standard physiological response. Julian let out a dark, bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any real humor. Standard physiological response. You always do that, Leo. You take the monster and you wrap him up in clinical terms. Because you aren't a monster, Julian, Leo countered firmly, shifting closer until their knees brushed. You are a man who survived being burned alive, and you are currently leading an empire through a war. Your body is doing exactly what it needs to do to keep you alive. Julian's dark gray eyes locked onto Leo, the intensity in them heavy and suffocating. If I had squeezed a fraction harder, I would have broken your arm. But you didn't, Leo said quietly, reaching out. He didn't hesitate this time. He took Julian's large, bruised hand in his own, lacing their fingers together. You recognized my scent. You stopped. The contact sent a visible tremor through Julian's massive frame. The aggressive ozone scent vanished entirely, instantly replaced by a warm, thick, intoxicating wave of pure cedar. The alpha's thumb slowly stroked the back of Leo's hand, a desperate, anchoring motion. You unlocked my shoulder, Leo, Julian murmured, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling vibration. But the rest of me, my mind is still in that fire. Antoniov knows you are here. He knows you are the only reason I can lift a gun today. The cage you are in right now, it's going to get smaller. Leo held the alpha's gaze, refusing to look away. If I am staying in this cage, Julian, I am doing it on my terms. I am not a hostage, and I am not a delicate piece of porcelain you get to lock in a vault and ignore. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of dominant possessiveness flaring. What exactly are your terms, Omega? My terms are that my work isn't finished, Leo stated, his voice laced with an ironclad medical authority that completely defied his secondary gender. Breaking the facial lock was step one. You have severe muscular atrophy in your right deltoid and massive scar tissue buildup that needs daily, intensive friction therapy. You will sit on the table for me every single day. You will not shut me out, and you will not treat me like collateral damage. Julian stared at the fiery, defiant Omega in his bed. A slow, incredibly dark, and utterly enamored smile spread across the Mafia boss's face. The sheer audacity of Leo Brooks, a civilian, an Omega, making demands of the Vance syndicate's head was staggering, and Julian was entirely captivated by it. Agreed, Julian murmured, lifting Leo's hand and pressing a slow, burning kiss to his knuckles. You have my body, Leo. Do whatever you want with it. The heavy, sensual weight of the words sent a massive jolt of heat straight to Leo's core, but before he could formulate a response, the intercom on the vault wall buzzed sharply. Julian's smile vanished. The predator returned. He reached over and hit the panel. Speak. Boss, Marcus's voice filtered through the heavy steel. The cleanup at the northern yards is done. We lost 12 men. The rest are secured. But the inner circle is in the penthouse. They need to see you. The families are panicking. They need to know the rumors of your recovery are true. Give me 5 minutes, Julian commanded coldly. He cut the connection and stood up, walking toward the massive walk-in closet. When he emerged, he was dressed in a pristine, tailored black suit, a dark crimson tie, and an aura of absolute, terrifying power. He looked like death wrapped in velvet. Julian walked over to the vault door, but he didn't open it immediately. He turned back to Leo, holding his hand out. Come with me, Julian ordered softly. Leo blinked, his heart skipping a beat. Out there? With your captains? Julian, I'm a civilian. I shouldn't be involved in syndicate business. You are already involved, Julian stated, his eyes dark and unwavering. Antoniov put a target on your back last night. If you stay hidden in the shadows, my men will view you as a weakness. I will not allow that. They need to see exactly what you are to me. Leo hesitated for only a fraction of a second before standing up. He smoothed down his wrinkled shirt and walked over, placing his hand in Julian's. The Alpha's fingers immediately closed around his, an unbreakable, possessive grip. Julian entered a passcode, and the heavy steel vault doors hissed open. They walked down the reinforced corridor and stepped into the sprawling, sunlit penthouse. The room was packed. At least 20 men, all massive, battle-hardened alphas, stood around the room. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, dried blood, and high-strung anxiety. The moment Julian Vance stepped into the room, absolute silence fell. Every eye locked onto the syndicate boss. They saw him standing tall, his right arm resting naturally at his side, the agonizing, crippled posture entirely gone. A collective, awestruck exhale rippled through the room. The king was truly back. But then, their eyes drifted down to Julian's left hand, firmly entwined with the Omega standing beside him. The heavy, dominant alpha pheromones in the room instantly spiked with confusion and territorial alarm. Several captains frowned, their eyes darting to Leo with suspicion. An Omega had no place in an inner-circle war council. Julian felt the shift in the air. His jaw locked, and a low, terrifying growl actually vibrated in his chest. He released a wave of dark cedar pheromones so brutally oppressive that two of the younger captains actually stumbled back, their knees buckling under the sheer force of their boss's dominance. Listen to me very carefully. Julian's voice was an icy, echoing blade that cut through the penthouse. This is Leo. He is the reason I am standing before you completely whole. He is the reason Antoniov's men died screaming in the dirt last night. Julian pulled Leo slightly closer, wrapping his arm securely around the Omega's waist in a blatant, undeniable claim of ownership. From this second forward, his word is my word, Julian declared, his black eyes sweeping over the room, daring any man to challenge him. He has full clearance. He walks where he wants. If he asks you for something, you provide it. If you disrespect him, you answer to me. And if anyone in this city so much as looks at him the wrong way, I will personally flay them alive. Do you understand? Yes, boss. The room echoed in absolute, terrified unison. Leo stood frozen against Julian's side, his mind reeling. The mafia boss hadn't just introduced him as a doctor. He had just elevated Leo to the highest tier of the Vance syndicate. He was untouchable. Marcus stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously, holding a small, blood-stained wooden box in his massive hands. Boss, Marcus said grimly, refusing to meet Julian's eyes. We found this on the body of Antoniov's lieutenant last night. It was addressed to you. Julian didn't let go of Leo. He reached out with his right hand, flawlessly, without a single hitch of pain, and flipped the lid of the box open. Inside sat a single, pristine white chess piece. The king. It had been brutally snapped perfectly in half. Julian stared at the broken piece, a cold, merciless smile curving his lips. He closed the box. Tell the men to arm up, Julian ordered softly, the dark promise of war soaking into the walls of the penthouse. Antoniov wants to play a game. Let's show him how the board has changed. End of Part 7. Part 8. The heavy steel doors of the Vance Tower lobby had locked hours ago, turning the 75th floor penthouse into a gilded, terrifying waiting room. Julian had been gone for exactly 4 hours and 22 minutes. Leo paced. He organized his medical bags. He sterilized every single surgical instrument in the penthouse medical suite. He did everything he could to silence the deafening roar of anxiety in his head. The city below was entirely dark, plunged into a forced blackout by Julian's cyber division to cover the syndicate's movements. Somewhere in that pitch-black maze of streets, a war was raging. Marcus stood by the mahogany doors, his massive arms crossed, his radio earpiece blinking with a faint blue light. The enforcer hadn't moved a muscle in 2 hours. Stop pacing, Doc, Marcus finally grunted, his voice a low rumble. You're burning a hole in the Italian marble. The boss knows what he's doing. This isn't his first war. It's his first war without a locked shoulder and chronic nerve damage. Leo shot back, his voice tight. He is running on a massive high of adrenaline and relief. He thinks he's invincible right now. That is exactly when men make lethal mistakes. Marcus frowned, pressing a thick finger to his earpiece as a burst of static flared. His expression instantly darkened. The ambient alpha pheromones in the room spiked with sudden, sharp distress. What? Leo demanded, his heart leaping into his throat. Marcus, what is it? Ambush at the docks, Marcus growled, pulling his heavy assault rifle from his shoulder sling. Antoniov didn't wait at his compound. He funneled our strike team into the shipping yards. It's a bloodbath. They're bringing the wounded back here. Leo didn't freeze. The panic vanished, instantly vaporized by the icy, clinical focus of a medical professional. How many? A dozen. Maybe more. The lower-level infirmary is compromised, Marcus said, his eyes wide. They're bringing them up here. Good, Leo commanded. He didn't sound like a terrified civilian anymore. He sounded like the man Julian Vance had introduced to the inner circle. He pointed at the therapy tables. Clear those. Get the emergency trauma kits from the lower vault. I need sterile water, combat gauze, and every 4 bag of saline we have. Move, Marcus. For a fraction of a second, the massive Alpha hesitated, entirely unused to taking direct orders from an Omega. But he remembered Julian's absolute command. His word is my word. Marcus nodded sharply and sprinted out the door. 10 minutes later, the private elevator chimed, and hell spilled into the penthouse. The pristine medical suite was instantly transformed into a frontline triage center. Men covered in blood, soot, and sweat were dragged into the room by their brothers. The overwhelming smell of copper, burned gunpowder, and terrified alpha pheromones flooded the air. Leo didn't flinch. He moved like a machine. He barked orders to the uninjured guards, directing them to apply pressure to wounds while he moved from man to man. He packed a deep bullet wound in a young enforcer's thigh, his hands completely steady despite the blood soaking his sleeves. He realigned a dislocated shoulder for another, using the exact leverage techniques he had perfected on Julian. Hold him down. Leo shouted over the groans of the wounded, pressing a heavy wad of combat gauze against a man's ruptured abdomen. Keep the pressure absolute. Do not let him go into shock. The men of the Vance Syndicate, hardened killers who feared nothing but their boss, watched the Omega work in sheer awe. Leo wasn't hiding behind the vault doors. He was bathed in their blood, fighting ferociously to keep them alive. In those frantic, bloody hours, Leo didn't just earn their respect. He earned their absolute, undying loyalty. But as he stitched a jagged laceration on a guard's arm, the private elevator chimed one final time. The doors slid open, and the entire room fell dead silent. Julian Vance stepped out. He was a terrifying sight. The untouchable king was coated in so much blood, it was impossible to tell what color his shirt had originally been. His dark hair was matted to his forehead, and his breathing was a harsh, wet rasp. In his left hand, he held a long, curved tactical blade, dripping crimson onto the polished marble. But it was his right side that made Leo's blood run entirely cold. A deep, horrific slash ran diagonally across Julian's chest, cutting straight through the ruined fabric of his shirt. It was a machete wound, vicious and jagged, meant to cleave him in half. Julian swayed heavily on his feet. The dark cedar pheromones radiating from him were completely sour, laced with the sharp, acidic tang of lethal pain and immense blood loss. Julian! Leo screamed, abandoning his current patient and sprinting across the room. He caught the massive Alpha just as his knees buckled. The sheer weight of Julian's body almost took Leo to the floor, but Marcus was there in a second, taking the brunt of the weight and helping to half-carry, half-drag the Mafia boss to the center therapy table. Out! Julian rasped, his voice a weak, terrifying shadow of its usual commanding baritone. His pitch-black eyes swept fiercely over the wounded men in the room. Everyone out. Now. Boss, you need. Marcus started. I said out. Julian roared, the sudden burst of violent alpha dominance, so heavy it physically forced several injured men to drop to their knees. He coughed, a terrible, wet sound. Only Leo. Leave us. The room emptied in less than 30 seconds. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving Leo entirely alone with the bleeding ruler of the underworld. Leo didn't waste a single second. He grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears and violently cut the ruined shirt off Julian's body, exposing the gruesome wound. It was deep, carving through the dense muscle of his pectoral, stopping just short of the ribs. The bleeding was profound. You reckless, arrogant bastard, Leo sobbed, his professional detachment finally shattering. Tears of absolute panic blurred his vision as he grabbed a stack of sterile gauze and pressed his entire body weight onto the wound to staunch the bleeding. You were supposed to be leading, not fighting on the front lines. Julian hissed in agony, his massive body arching off the table, his blood-stained hands blindly reaching out. His fingers found Leo's hips, gripping the Omega with bruising, desperate force. Antoniov is dead. Julian choked out, a dark, bloody smile curling his pale lips. I took his head myself. The war is over, Leo. The northern lines are ours. I don't care about the lines. Leo shouted, his voice cracking. He reached blindly for the medical stapler and the heavy-duty suturing kit. I care that you are bleeding out on my table. Hold still, damn it. I'm not dying, Julian murmured, his eyes fluttering slightly as the blood loss took its toll. I can't die. You wouldn't let me. You're right, I won't, Leo growled fiercely. He worked with a desperate, frantic precision. He cleaned the jagged edges of the wound, his hands slick with the alpha's blood. Julian didn't make a sound as Leo drove the curved suturing needle through his flesh, pulling the deep laceration tightly closed. The Mafia boss just stared up at the Omega, his gray eyes burning with an emotion so intense, so consuming, it eclipsed the physical agony. When the final stitch was tied off, Leo wrapped Julian's chest in thick, tight compression bandages. He stepped back, entirely exhausted, his chest heaving, his hands trembling violently. You're stable, Leo whispered, his legs suddenly feeling like water. He leaned heavily against the edge of the metal table. You lost a massive amount of blood, but the artery was missed. You're going to live. Julian didn't answer immediately. He stared at Leo. He looked at the blood-staining Leo's face, his clothes, his hands. The Omega smelled of panic, copper, and sheer exhaustion, but beneath it all, the sweet, intoxicating scent of honey and devotion flared brighter than a beacon in the dark. Julian slowly reached out with his uninjured right arm, the arm Leo had healed. He grabbed the back of Leo's neck and pulled him down with unstoppable force. Leo gasped, crashing flush against Julian's bandaged chest. You saved my men, Julian murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble right against Leo's ear. I saw them looking at you. I smelled their loyalty. They don't just see a doctor anymore, Leo. They see my Omega. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. The proximity was suffocating, intoxicating. Julian, you need to rest. No, Julian interrupted, his grip on the back of Leo's neck tightening, tilting the Omega's head to the side, completely exposing the pale, rapidly pulsing skin of his scent gland. The air in the room shifted violently. The scent of dark cedar became overwhelmingly thick, a possessive, territorial blanket that completely smothered every other smell in the penthouse. Julian's eyes were pitch black again, the primal alpha entirely taking control. Antoniov is dead, Julian whispered, his hot breath brushing against Leo's exposed neck. The city is mine, but I need them to know that you are mine. Absolutely. Irrevocably. Leo's breath hitched. He knew exactly what was about to happen. His Omega biology flared, a massive, dizzying wave of submissive heat washing through his veins, practically begging for the claim. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. Julian opened his mouth and pressed his lips firmly against Leo's scent gland. He didn't use his teeth. It wasn't a mating bite, not yet. But he inhaled deeply, drawing Leo's sweet scent directly into his lungs, and then deliberately, forcefully rubbed his own jaw and lips against the sensitive gland. He was scent-marking him. A heavy, undeniable, chemical claim. A sharp whine tore from Leo's throat. His hands clutched desperately at the clean sheets beneath Julian, his entire body trembling violently under the sheer weight of the alpha's dominance. The dark cedar pheromones seeped directly into Leo's skin, fusing with his own scent, effectively branding him. To any alpha, beta, or omega who walked past him tomorrow, Leo Brooks would smell entirely, exclusively of Julian Vance. Julian finally pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with dark, possessive triumph. He looked at the reddened skin of Leo's neck, completely saturated with his own scent. Now, Julian rasped, his hand sliding down to rest heavily over Leo's racing heart. Now they know. Leo collapsed completely against Julian's chest, entirely overcome by the biological rush of the scent claim. He buried his face in the crook of the Mafia boss's neck, breathing in the dark cedar, the blood, the absolute danger of the man who had just conquered a city to keep him safe. The golden cage was gone. Leo realized, with terrifying clarity, that he was exactly where he belonged. End of Part 8. Part 9. The biological aftermath of an alpha's scent mark was not a gentle transition. It was a total rewiring of the nervous system. Leo Brooks sat in the heavy leather chair beside the therapy table, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his trembling hands. The sterile lights of the penthouse medical suite had been dimmed to a soft, ambient glow. The wounded men had been transferred to secure, private recovery rooms on the lower floors. The blood had been cleaned from the Italian marble. The chaos was over. But inside Leo's veins, a quiet, profound revolution was taking place. His Omega biology was singing, a frantic, thrumming vibration of absolute security and possessive warmth. Every time he inhaled, the heavy, intoxicating scent of dark cedar and ozone filled his lungs, overriding his own natural scent. Julian Vance hadn't just claimed him. He had draped him in an invisible, impenetrable armor of alpha dominance. To the outside world, Leo was now an extension of the syndicate's absolute ruler. A low, pained groan broke the silence. Leo's head snapped up. On the therapy table, Julian was trying to push himself into a sitting position. The thick compression bandages wrapped tightly around his massive chest were stark white, but a faint bloom of crimson was already beginning to seep through the center where the machete had carved into his pectoral muscle. "Don't you dare move," Leo commanded, his voice raspy from exhaustion but laced with absolute, ironclad medical authority. He was out of the chair in a second, crossing the room and planting his hands firmly on Julian's uninjured left shoulder to push him back down. "You have 24 deep internal sutures and a massive blood volume deficit. If you tear those stitches, you will hemorrhage, and I am entirely out of O-negative blood." Julian resisted for a fraction of a second, his pitch-black eyes flashing with residual combat aggression. But the moment he felt Leo's hands, the fight drained out of him. He sank back against the pillows, his broad chest heaving. "I have to get up," Julian rasped, his voice a gravelly shadow of its usual commanding rumble. "Antoniov is dead, but his lieutenants will scatter. There will be a power vacuum in the northern districts. The other families will try to claim the territory before the sun comes up. I need to address the captains." "You are not addressing anyone," Leo said fiercely, checking the edges of the bandages. "You are going into hypovolemic shock. Your core temperature is dropping. The only thing you are doing is staying on this table and letting your body regenerate." "Leo," Julian murmured, his large left hand coming up to weakly grip Leo's wrist. The touch was branding, sending a shockwave of heat up Leo's arm. "You don't understand my world. A wounded king is a dead king. If the inner circle thinks I am incapacitated, the alliance will fracture. I have to show my face." Before Leo could argue, the heavy mahogany doors of the suite pushed open. Marcus stepped in. The giant enforcer looked like he had been through a meat grinder. His suit was torn, his face smeared with soot, and a bandage was wrapped tightly around his bicep. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his eyes instantly dropping to the floor. The Alpha Enforcer was actively avoiding looking directly at Leo. The scent mark on the Omega's neck was so overwhelmingly potent, so aggressively saturated with Julian's dominance, that Marcus's own biology was forcing him to show deference. "Boss," Marcus addressed Julian, his voice tight. "The 5 underbosses of the allied families are in the 74th floor boardroom. They're demanding a parley. Rumors are spreading that you took a fatal hit at the docks. They want proof of life, or they're threatening to pull their men from the northern perimeter." Julian's jaw locked. A terrifying, cold fury settled over his pale features. "Tell them I will be down in 5 minutes." "Absolutely not," Leo snapped, whirling around to face Marcus. "Tell them to go to hell. If he stands up, his blood pressure will bottom out, and he will collapse before he even reaches the elevator." Marcus looked trapped, his eyes darting frantically between his bleeding, lethal boss and the fiercely protective Omega, who carried his boss's absolute authority. "Leo, step aside," Julian commanded. It wasn't a request. The dark cedar pheromones in the room spiked, a heavy wave of pressure designed to force compliance. Leo didn't even blink. He leaned directly into the Alpha's space, the scent mark on his neck practically burning as his own stubbornness flared against the dominance. "No. You put me in charge of your body, Julian. And right now your body is failing. You are not walking into a room full of sharks while bleeding out." Julian stared at him, his gray eyes widening fractionally at the sheer, unadulterated defiance. No one defied Julian Vance. But as the Mafia boss looked at the Omega, covered in blood, completely exhausted, yet standing like an impenetrable shield between him and the rest of the world, the anger melted into something dangerously close to worship. "If I don't go," Julian whispered, the exhaustion finally bleeding into his voice, "the alliance breaks. Blood will run in the streets by dawn." Leo took a slow, deep breath. He looked at Julian, seeing the desperation of a man who carried an entire empire on his shoulders. Then Leo turned to Marcus. "Are the underbosses armed?" Leo asked, his voice suddenly dropping into a chillingly calm, collected tone that sounded entirely out of place for a physical therapist. Marcus blinked, taken aback. "No. The boardroom is a neutral zone. Weapons are surrendered at the door. But they are all dominant alphas, document. And they are angry." Leo nodded once. He reached over to the sterile tray, picked up a clean white towel, and methodically wiped the dried blood from his hands and face. He unbuttoned the ruined, blood-soaked cuffs of his shirt and rolled them up to his elbows. "I'll go," Leo stated. The silence in the medical suite was deafening. "No," Julian growled instantly, his hand snapping out to grab Leo's arm, his grip bruising despite his weakness. "Absolutely not. You are not walking into a room of hostile alphas. They will tear you apart." "They won't touch me," Leo said softly, turning back to Julian. He reached out and gently cupped the alpha's pale cheek. "Because I smell entirely of you. You marked me, Julian. You wanted them to know I am yours. Let me prove to them what that actually means." Julian's chest heaved. He stared into Leo's eyes, searching for a trace of hesitation, a flicker of civilian terror. He found absolutely none. He only found the icy, unwavering resolve of a man who had finally accepted the crown he had been handed. Julian slowly released his grip on Leo's arm. "Marcus," the boss rasped, "you stand at his right hand. If any man in that room raises their voice to him, you put a bullet in their kneecap." "Understood, boss," Marcus said grimly. Leo turned and walked out of the suite, the heavy doors closing behind him. The elevator ride down to the 74th floor felt like descending into a gladiatorial arena. Marcus stood silently beside him, radiating a tense, deadly vigilance. Leo's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his face was an absolute mask of stone. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal a massive, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the blackened city. Sitting around the sprawling obsidian table were the 5 underbosses of the Vance Alliance. They were huge, battle-scarred men in expensive suits, radiating impatience, arrogance, and heavy alpha pheromones. They were arguing loudly, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. When Leo stepped into the room, the arguments ceased instantly. 5 pairs of eyes snapped to the doorway. They expected the towering, terrifying presence of Julian Vance. Instead, they saw a slender, exhausted Omega with rolled-up sleeves and blood-stained slacks. For 2 seconds, there was profound confusion. Then the scent hit them. The heavy, suffocating aura of Julian Vance's dark cedar pheromones rolled into the room, but it wasn't coming from Julian. It was radiating directly from the Omega. The scent mark on Leo's neck was a biological screaming siren of absolute ownership and untouchable status. The underbosses instantly stiffened, their own alpha biology violently recoiling from the aggressive, territorial claim wrapping the Omega. A large, heavily bearded alpha at the end of the table, Silas, the head of the Western Docks, stood up, his face flushed with insulted rage. "What is this? Is this a joke? Where is Vance? I don't parley with pets." Marcus's hand instantly dropped to the heavy pistol holstered at his hip, but Leo raised a single finger, silencing the enforcer without even looking at him. Leo didn't stop at the doorway. He walked directly to the head of the obsidian table, Julian's empty chair. He didn't sit down. He placed his hands flat on the polished black glass and leaned forward, his eyes locking dead onto Silas. "Mr. Vance is currently unavailable to entertain your panic," Leo said, his voice ringing with a cold, terrifying clarity that sent a shiver down the spine of every man in the room. "He is busy coordinating the systemic dismantling of what remains of Antoniov's empire. He sent me to deliver a message." "You?" Silas scoffed, though he didn't take a step closer. The scent rolling off Leo was too intensely dangerous. "You're an Omega. You don't speak for the Syndicate. I speak with the authority of the man who just slaughtered 200 of your enemies while you hid in your fortified compounds." Leo shot back, his voice dropping into a lethal, venomous whisper. The absolute lack of fear in his eyes was unnerving. "Julian Vance took Antoniov's head tonight. The northern lines are secured. The Vance Syndicate is entirely intact. And if any of you attempt to move your men into his newly acquired territory before the sun rises, he will consider it an act of war, and he will turn his attention to you next." The room was dead silent. The sheer audacity of the Omega, standing in the seat of power and delivering a death threat to 5 Mafia bosses, was staggering. "He's bleeding out, isn't he?" Another underboss muttered darkly from the shadows. "That's why he sent you." Antoniov gutted him. Leo slowly turned his head to look at the man. His professional mask was flawless. He didn't blink. He didn't betray a single ounce of the terror he had felt while stitching Julian's chest closed. "Julian Vance's right arm was locked in paralysis for 8 years, Leo said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Last night, He lifted a grown man off his feet by the sternum and drove a blade through his heart. His body is flawless. His mind is absolute. If you want to test him, by all means step out of line. But know that if you do, there won't be a table left to negotiate at tomorrow. Leo stood up straight, adjusting his cuffs with slow, deliberate precision. The alliance stands, Leo commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. You will hold your perimeters. You will wait for your new territorial assignments. And you will not question his authority again. This meeting is concluded. Leo turned on his heel and walked out of the boardroom. Marcus followed closely behind, his eyes wide with a profound, terrifying realization. The syndicate didn't just have a king anymore. They had a queen who was just as capable of slitting their throats. When Leo returned to the 75th floor, his adrenaline completely crashed. His knees wobbled as he pushed open the mahogany doors to the medical suite. Julian was exactly where Leo had left him, but the Alpha was awake, his dark eyes burning like twin suns. On the bedside table, a small two-way radio lay open. Julian had listened to every single word. Leo walked over, his legs feeling like lead, and collapsed into the chair beside the bed. He let out a long, shaky breath, burying his face in his hands. They bought it, Leo whispered, entirely drained. They backed down. Julian didn't speak. He reached out with his uninjured arm, wrapping his hand around the back of Leo's neck, pulling the Omega forward until Leo's forehead rested against the edge of the mattress, right beside Julian's uninjured shoulder. You didn't just speak for me, Leo, Julian murmured, his voice thick with an obsession so deep it was consuming him alive. His fingers tangled in Leo's hair, holding him fiercely. You ruled them. You ruled my entire empire. Leo closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of cedar and blood. He was terrified, exhausted, and hopelessly, irrevocably trapped in the dark. But as Julian's hand stroked his hair, a quiet, dangerous truth settled into his bones. He didn't just survive the wolves. He had learned how to lead them. End of Part 9. Part 10. 3 weeks later, the Vance Tower did not look like a fortress bracing for a siege, nor did it smell of blood and burned gunpowder. The heavy steel shutters that had once sealed the 75th floor penthouse from the world had been raised, allowing the golden hues of the setting sun to spill across the pristine Italian marble. The city below was quiet, entirely subjugated, resting firmly in the palm of Julian Vance's hand. But inside the sprawling medical suite, the absolute ruler of the underworld was currently following orders. Reach higher, Leo Brooks instructed, his voice echoing softly in the tranquil room. He stood a few feet away, leaning against the edge of a therapy table, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing a soft, oversized gray sweater that kept slipping off one shoulder, a piece of clothing that clearly belonged to the massive Alpha standing in the center of the room. Julian, shirtless and bathed in the warm sunset light, raised his right arm. The movement was a revelation. It was entirely fluid, devoid of the agonizing catch and the heavy mechanical stiffness that had plagued him for 8 years. He reached straight up toward the ceiling, his bicep brushing against his ear. The newly formed, jagged pink scar running diagonally across his chest from the machete wound stretched tightly, but the underlying muscle held firm. Julian lowered his arm slowly, rolling the shoulder in a smooth, continuous circle. He looked at his own hand, then across the room at the Omega who had given it back to him. Zero resistance, Julian murmured, his deep baritone vibrating with a profound, quiet awe that hadn't faded over the last 3 weeks. The nerve pain is entirely gone. Even the deep tissue aches have faded. It feels like the fire never happened. Leo smiled, a soft, immensely proud expression that reached all the way to his eyes. He picked up a small digital tablet and made a final swipe across the screen. Your range of motion is at 100%. The facial tissue has completely remodeled around the burned scars, and the laceration on your chest is healing flawlessly. Medically speaking, Julian, you are discharged. The words hung in the air, sudden and heavy. Julian's hand dropped to his side. The relaxed, peaceful atmosphere in the room instantly vanished, entirely eclipsed by a sudden, suffocating spike of dark cedar pheromones. The Alpha took a slow step forward, his storm gray eyes locking onto Leo with a predatory intensity that made the Omega's pulse jump. Discharged, Julian repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a lethal threat. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, deliberate strides, stopping only when his bare chest was mere inches from Leo. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Brooks? Leo didn't step back. He tilted his head up, his own scent of warm honey rising to meet the heavy cedar, completely unafraid of the towering mafia boss. "It is my professional opinion. The job you hired me for is done. Your body doesn't need me anymore." Julian's eyes darkened to the color of a bruised twilight. He raised both hands, placing them flat on the edge of the therapy table on either side of Leo's hips, effectively trapping the Omega. "My body," Julian said softly, leaning down until his lips were a breath away from Leo's, "might be healed. But if you think for one solitary second that you are ever leaving this tower, you are out of your brilliant, beautiful mind." Leo let out a breathy laugh, his hands coming up to rest naturally against Julian's waist. Over the past 3 weeks, this had become their new normal. The war with Antoniov had ended in absolute victory, but the battle between their biologies had evolved into a deep, consuming devotion. "I remember a time when you told me dependence was a death sentence," Leo whispered, his fingers tracing the edge of the fading bruises on Julian's ribs. "I was wrong," Julian admitted without a shred of hesitation. The ruthless king of the syndicate, a man who had slaughtered an army to protect his territory, yielded entirely to the Omega in his arms. "You aren't a weakness, Leo. You are the only reason I have a soul left. When you walked into that boardroom and brought my underbosses to their knees, you didn't just save my empire. You cemented your place at the center of it." Julian shifted closer, pressing his forehead against Leo's. The Alpha closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The scent mark on Leo's neck, the aggressive, temporary claim Julian had left in the bloody aftermath of the war, had faded. It was a biological reality. Scent marks required constant, daily renewal to remain potent. For the last 21 days, Julian had dutifully refreshed it, wrapping Leo in his protective aura. But today, the heavy cedar had thinned, leaving only Leo's natural, sweet scent in the air. Julian's jaw tightened. He opened his eyes, and the sheer depth of possessive need in them made Leo's breath catch in his throat. "The war is over," Julian said, his voice dropping into a rough, vulnerable whisper. "The perimeter is secure. Antoniov is dust. No one is hunting you anymore, Leo. The doors to the vault are open. The elevators are unlocked. You could walk out of here right now, go back to your quiet clinic, and never look back at the blood and the monsters." It was the ultimate test. Julian Vance was a man who took what he wanted, but he was painfully, acutely aware that he had dragged an innocent healer into a world of violence. He was offering Leo the one thing a mafia boss never gave, an exit. Leo looked at the man he had saved. He saw the scars of the past, the brutal reality of the present, and the terrifying, absolute love burning in Julian's eyes. "My clinic is closed, Julian," Leo said softly, his voice unwavering. He slid his arms up, wrapping them securely around the Alpha's thick neck. "And I don't want a quiet life. Not anymore. I want the man who tore down a city to keep me safe. I want the monster who purrs when I fix his shoulder. I am exactly where I belong." A shudder ran through Julian's massive frame. The last remaining fragment of his restraint snapped. Julian wrapped his powerful arms around Leo's waist and lifted him effortlessly off the floor. Leo gasped, instinctively wrapping his legs around Julian's hips as the Alpha carried him away from the medical suite, through the heavy mahogany doors, and down the reinforced corridor toward the inner vault. The heavy steel doors hissed shut behind them, sealing them in the sprawling, dimly lit sanctuary. Julian didn't carry him to the bed. Instead, he pressed Leo firmly against the cool concrete wall, his body an immovable, burning shield. The dark cedar pheromones exploded into the room, no longer just a territorial warning to outside threats, but a profound, overwhelming declaration of intent. "I don't want to scent mark you anymore, Leo," Julian growled, his chest heaving against Leo's. His hands gripped Leo's thighs, holding him securely. "A scent mark washes away. It fades. I want them to know you are mine in a way that can never be undone. I want it in your blood." Leo's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. His Omega biology flared into absolute overdrive. The submissive heat that pooled in his core wasn't born of fear. It was born of a primal, overwhelming desire to be entirely consumed by his Alpha. "Then do it," Leo breathed, his eyes fluttering shut as he tilted his head violently to the side, completely exposing the pale, rapidly pulsing skin of his neck. "Claim me, Julian. Permanently." Julian let out a dark, guttural sound, a pure, unfiltered Alpha roar of triumph. He buried his face in the crook of Leo's neck. For a fleeting second, his lips brushed softly against the racing pulse of the scent gland, a silent vow of protection and reverence. Then, Julian opened his mouth, his jaw unhinging slightly, and his sharp canines elongated. He sank his teeth deep into the scent gland. Leo cried out, a sharp, breathless gasp that echoed through the concrete vault. The pain was a blinding, brilliant flash of white-hot lightning, but it lasted only a fraction of a second before it was entirely swallowed by an overwhelming, tidal wave of pure euphoria. The mating bite was absolute. It wasn't just a physical wound. It was a biological fusion. As Julian's venom mixed with Leo's bloodstream, their nervous systems violently linked. Leo could suddenly feel the erratic, thundering beat of Julian's heart as if it were inside his own chest. He could feel the alpha's profound, earth-shattering love, his fierce protectiveness, and his terrifying, unending devotion. Julian held the bite, drinking in the sweet, honey-laced scent of the Omega as it fundamentally altered to permanently weave with his own dark cedar. He held Leo impossibly tight, absorbing the violent trembling of the Omega's body as the bond cemented itself into their very souls. When Julian finally pulled back, his lips were stained with a faint trace of Leo's blood. His chest heaved, his pitch-black eyes slowly returning to a stormy, blown-out gray. Leo slumped against the wall, entirely boneless, held upright only by Julian's massive strength. He was panting, his skin flushed, his eyes hazy with the intoxicating high of the bond. He reached up with trembling fingers, tracing the deep, permanent puncture marks on his own neck. They throbbed with a warm, heavy pulse that matched Julian's heartbeat perfectly. "Mine," Julian whispered reverently, pressing a tender, lingering kiss over the bleeding bite mark. "My Omega. My king." Leo let out a breathless, exhausted laugh, burying his face in the crook of Julian's neck, breathing in the scent of cedar that now fundamentally belonged to him. "Your doctor, too. Don't forget who still has to massage that scar tissue tomorrow." Julian chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated straight through Leo's chest. The untouchable mafia boss, the most feared man in the country, carefully carried his newly bonded mate over to the massive dark oak bed. He laid Leo down against the soft charcoal sheets, climbing in beside him and pulling the Omega flush against his chest. Outside the steel walls of the vault, the city of millions went about its night, entirely unaware of the shift in power. They didn't know that the Vance syndicate was stronger than it had ever been. They didn't know that the crippled Alpha had been unchained, or that the man pulling the strings was a civilian with a medical bag and an iron will. As Leo drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, wrapped entirely in the protective, invincible embrace of his Alpha, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Mafia Alpha hadn't been touched in 8 years. But the Omega who finally did hadn't just healed his body. He had conquered his entire world. End of story. Wow, let's just all take a collective deep breath after that one. Seriously, my heart is still pounding. What an incredible, intense journey. Welcome to the outro, guys, and let's just take a moment to sit down and really unpack everything that just happened between Julian and Leo, because there is so much to talk about here. At first glance, this story looks like your classic big, dangerous Mafia Alpha captures the sweet Omega trope, right? But the absolute genius of this dynamic is how it completely flips that expectation on its head. Julian Vance is this untouchable, terrifying king who hasn't let anyone near him in years. He built a bloody empire on fear, isolation, and chronic pain. But the very second Leo puts his hands on him, the entire power dynamic shifts. It wasn't Julian's physical strength that won this war. It was Leo's unyielding psychological fortitude. Think about it. Leo is an Omega who literally stared down the most lethal Alpha in the city and said, "No, you are going to follow my rules." He didn't submit to the crushing pheromones, he didn't cower at the gunfire, and he walked into a boardroom full of hostile Mafia underbosses and brought them to their knees without firing a single shot. That boardroom scene? Absolutely iconic. He didn't just heal Julian's physical burn scars, he healed the fractured, paranoid parts of the Alpha soul. And let's talk about Julian's possessiveness for a second. It is so dark and intense, but it stems from such a raw place of vulnerability. He realized almost instantly that Leo was his tether to humanity. That scent-marking scene in the medical suite, right after the doc's ambush, the tension was completely off the charts. It showed exactly how incredibly thin the line is between a predator's instinct and absolute, unconditional devotion. Julian didn't want to cage Leo to control him. He wanted to cage the entire world to keep Leo safe. But I really want to hear from you guys now. Let's make this a conversation in the comments section. What was the most intense moment for you? Was it the very first time Leo pressed his hands into Julian's scars and refused to back down? Or was it the moment Julian came back to the vault covered in blood, and Leo stitched him up without hesitating? And here is a question for all my deep thinkers out there. Do you think Julian was already completely hooked on day one when Leo didn't flinch? Or did it happen later in the vault when Leo proved he wouldn't run away? Tell me all your thoughts down below. I read every single one of your comments, and I absolutely love seeing your theories and reactions. If you enjoyed diving into this dark, intense, and incredibly romantic Alpha and Omega world with me today, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It tells the YouTube algorithm that you want more stories exactly like this one. And if you're new here, make sure to click subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you never miss out on our next steamy adventure. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Your support means the absolute world to this channel, and I truly couldn't do this without you. You've been listening to your BL boyfriend, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, stay passionate, and bye for now.